Chapter 1542. Especially after they were 2 li away from the city gate, they were already very close to the 5-star army. However, when they still couldn't see the enemy cavalry charging out, Sinjar couldn't help but reveal a joyful expression. The distance was too close. Even if the 5-star army cavalry charged, they wouldn't have the advantage of speed. At that time he would have the complete upper hand. Just as he was sighing in his heart that the 5-star army was only as so, a flash of fire suddenly appeared in Sinjar's eyes. Just as he instinctively felt that something was wrong, a cannonball landed a few dozen meters away from him. The cavalry at that location immediately let out a burst of cries and howls. Let's not talk about the place where the cannonballs landed and the cavalrymen were blown away. When the nearby cavalrymen heard the loud rumbling sound, they all went crazy. Under the fear, they didn't listen to their master's orders. Instead, they ran around and threw the cavalrymen on their backs off their horses. The cannonball was so loud that it caused the horses to run around like headless flies. There was no need for the 5-star army to do anything. The Sudanese cavalry that was originally in formation was already in chaos. The chaos in the formation greatly exceeded Sinjar's expectations. He originally wanted to charge out, but he couldn't help but slow down. After he realized that something was wrong, he didn't have a better idea. They had already charged out. Could it be that they had to retreat back into the city? The city was currently on fire. If they stayed there, the city would be breached sooner or later. Rather than that, they might as well give it a try. Everyone, don't be afraid. Continue to charge. As long as we charge out, we will live. He shouted loudly to boost the morale of the army. This shout finally stopped the chaos in the cavalry. Of course, the most important thing was that the cannonballs had already been fired. After the cannonballs stopped, the cavalry seemed to have regained their spirit. When they saw that the 5-star army was less than 2 li away from them, in order to survive, they mustered up their courage and ran forward with all their might. Don't be in a hurry. Fire after 300 meters. Seeing that the enemy cavalry was no longer as imposing as before, Commander Xiaofeng felt even more confident. He chuckled and spoke unhurriedly. The effective range of the 95 style was around 400 to 500 paces. If the wind was blowing, it was possible to hit further away. At 300 paces away, anyone who was hit by a bullet would be severely injured if not killed instantly. The 2 regiments of Cold Vanguard were not in a hurry, but the Sudanese cavalry were excited. They thought that the 5-star army was at their wits' end, and they charged forward bravely with the desire to live. Quick, there are less than 500 steps left. Victory is right in front of us, huh? Protected by his bodyguards, Single, who was riding on his horse, returned to his usual self of strategizing. His experience on the battlefield told him that at such a close distance, even the 5-star army's cavalry would be restrained by him. He could almost see victory waving at him. 450 steps. 400 steps. 350 steps. 300 steps. Fire. When they were 300 paces away, Commander Xiaofeng's voice thundered. The Cold Vanguard soldiers who had been waiting impatiently for a long time were waiting for this order. The light and heavy machine guns, coupled with the 95-style rapid fire, rained down on the Sudanese cavalry, causing them to fall to the ground one after another. Under the dense barrage of bullets, no one could break through this layer of obstruction and take a step forward. When the bullets hit a person or a horse, the Sudanese cavalry fully understood the principle of courting death by charging forward bravely. Unfortunately, it was courting death. Whoever charged faster would die faster. Under the indiscriminate barrage of bullets, no cavalry could charge within 250 paces, let alone injure the enemy. Seeing batch after batch, at least half of the cavalry died in the charge. The remaining Sudanese cavalry finally had a drastic change in expression. Without waiting for orders, they turned around and fled. In the face of this blockade of death, no one would be able to remain calm. Single's luck was not bad, perhaps because he did not charge at the front, but he survived. However, there were times when being alive was far more unbearable than being dead. Just like the current him, seeing the cavalry under his command fall down wave after wave as if they were cut chives, and then no one was able to stand up again, he was truly scared silly. He had seen the power of firearms before, but they were usually limited to short range and reloading was very troublesome. Facing the charge of the cavalry, they could only launch one wave of attacks. Needless to say, the accuracy of the attacks was even worse. For the elite cavalry, the lethality of the attacks was very limited. Although they couldn't be ignored, the attacks wouldn't affect the cavalry's charge. They would only cause a certain amount of damage to the formation of the infantry. Unlike the firearms in the hands of the 5-star army, they were really good at reaping lives. The bullets seemed to be endless. The faster the cavalry charged, the more they died. This was an undefeatable enemy. Single finally understood why the Khanate alliance, which had a total of 1 million men, was defeated by the 5-star army, which only had a few 100,000 men. The more he thought about it, the more afraid he became. This nightmare was finally his turn. How could he defeat such an opponent? It seemed like the only choice was to escape. Single was terrified. He led his cavalry of less than 5,000 and turned to flee. They wanted to get out of the firing range of the muskets. As for where to go next, they would not wait for death here. It's finally our turn, right? Charge. The commander of the Mulbei division, Xin Honghai, had been waiting for a long time. Seeing the enemy cavalry start to flee, about to escape the firing range of the guns, he laughed and led the cavalry of the Mulbei division to charge. Along with them were 10,000 cavalry from Meng 3 division. Although their division commander Chiwen was not in the direction of the south gate, the leading general still shouted and charged after Mo Bei division. This scene was seen by Beta Persei from afar. At this time, there were 1,000 fully armed black cavalry behind him. Fuck, who ordered them to charge? Hurry, hurry, or we won't even get to drink soup. Beta Persei was anxious. He rushed over as soon as he heard the enemy cavalry rushing out from the south gate, but it seemed like he was still one step too late. Charge. There were firearms waiting to reap his life. Run. There were countless 5-star army chasing after him, also waiting to reap his life. Seeing that he would die no matter what, Single, who didn't want to die, rolled his eyes and made a very unmanly decision. That was to dismount and surrender. No one was willing to surrender, but after seeing the air force and powerful firearms of the 5-star army, the pride in Single's heart had long been destroyed. After knowing that he would die if he continued to fight, he wisely chose to surrender. Although it would not look good on his face, it was better to live than to die. Only by living could people have the right to talk about everything. Even their commander, Sinclair, had taken the initiative to surrender. How could the soldiers under him still care about their reputation? They immediately got off their horses and knelt down to surrender, causing the 5-star army cavalry to feel as though they were punching cotton. All of this happened to be seen by young heir, who was chasing after them. He immediately laughed out loud and thought to himself, "Who told you to not wait for me, your second brother? Great, now you won't have the chance to kill people anymore, right?" The enemies at the south gate had all surrendered except for those who died in battle. They were not the first to choose to surrender, nor were they the first to end the battle. The progress at the east gate was faster than them. They were all infantrymen and they were first attacked by artillery. Many of them were already scared out of their wits. Then when they finally reached 300 steps in front of the 5-star army, the scene of firearms firing swallowed their last bit of courage. At that time, when the 5-star army cavalry charged, there was no other choice but to surrender. This battle lasted from 9 in the morning to 3 in the afternoon. From the beginning to the end it was only 6 hours. More than 20,000 of the 60,000 Sudanese soldiers were killed, and more than 30,000 of them surrendered. The battle ended so quickly that the Sudanese people in the city lost all hope. For a time, many people rushed out of the city gate. They were holding bags of various sizes, which were the most valuable things in their homes. They knelt on the ground and begged the 5-star army not to kill them. They surrendered. "Young master, do you want to send someone into the city to take a look?" Beta Persei saw that the people in the city had come out to surrender. He thought that Lahore city was already in his hands, so he said with a smile, "There's no need. The temperature in the city isn't too low right now. Moreover, the fire hasn't been completely extinguished yet. Let's wait a little longer. We don't lack the time to wait." Yang Qindong shook his head. Xianxia was able to achieve what he had today under his leadership. Naturally, Dazong played a very important role, but at the same time his cautiousness was also very important. Otherwise, in the face of so many ambitious and ruthless people, he would have been eaten alive long ago, leaving not even his bones behind. Yes. Facing Yang Qindong's cautiousness, Beta Persei's face also became a lot more serious. He also began to reflect on whether he was a little too complacent after winning the battle. It seems that he has to change in the future and become more calm. It's just that Beta Persei has nothing to do with the word calm. It was not easy to teach this kind of person who would shout and scream whenever there was a battle to be cautious. Chapter 1543. The city of Lahore changed hands just like that. Because the five-star army had set up an encirclement in advance and did not let any enemy escape, the news did not spread. It was likely that many people were still hoping for a counterattack. The Indian army was the most typical example. The world's first cavalry army and the first cavalry army were like two meteors that streaked across the sky. They entered the Indian territory at lightning speed and took over the important border city of Tultan. Next, they split up and attacked from two directions. In a short period of time, they caught the Indian army off guard and took over a dozen cities. When the news reached the capital of India, King Jawaharlal Nehru was really shocked. He originally thought that the appearance of the five-star army would lead to a battle with the Delhi Sultanate. By then, no matter who won or lost, he would be able to act according to the situation. He would have ample time to prepare and reap the benefits. Who would have thought that the enemy would appear so soon? Also, from the information he received, the five-star army did not take over Lahore. How did they have the courage to enter the Indian territory? Was they not afraid that the Sultanate would cut off their path of retreat? At this time, Nehru still could not see his own weakness, which was being conservative. He rarely fought outside. Occasionally he would send troops to fight against small countries like the Sultanate. This made him feel very good and he thought that the Indian army was invincible. This mentality of not being able to go out and take a look was similar to the mentality of the Qing army in the late Qing dynasty. When such an army encountered a truly powerful force, the opponent would teach them how to behave in a matter of minutes. There were too many things that he could not understand, but time did not allow Nehru to think too much. He also received news that the battleships of the five-star army had begun to move towards some coastal towns in the country. Unfortunately, the city he was in was close to the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean. This kind of attack from both land and sea really gave him a headache. If it was only a unilateral attack by the army or navy, he would not be afraid. India had a population of nearly 10 million. In addition to the 500,000 standing army, it could recruit no less than 1 million troops at any time. With this, he was confident that he could use the human wave tactic to drive out any opponent that entered the country. However, when the land and sea came together, he felt very passive. It seemed that he couldn't attack either one first. Moving the capital. After thinking about it, it seemed that this was the only decision that could solve his crisis in the shortest time possible. As long as he was far away from the coastal cities, the threat of the five-star army's navy would be reduced to the lowest. At that time he would have more than enough time to fight against the five-star army. Moving the capital was a huge matter and involved too many things. It wasn't something that could be done just because one wanted to. When Zhu Di wanted to move the capital of the great Ming dynasty from Nanjing to Beijing, he had prepared for several years. However, what Nehru lacked the most now was time. If he continued to wait, how many more cities would the 100,000 cavalrymen of the five-star army attack? Also, once the five-star army's navy appeared outside Mumbai, he could only passively take a beating. In order to not worsen the situation, Nehru first chose the location of the new capital, which was Bidar city in the central region of the country. Not far from the city was the Godavari River, which could be used as a barrier to block the charge of the five-star army's cavalrymen. Moreover, there were many mountains and roads that were not convenient. If it was during normal times, it would be somewhat unsuitable as the capital. After all, it was not conducive to economic development. However, during wartime it was the best place to defend. It was similar to Chongqing in the country. After making the decision, Nehru summoned the civil and military officials and announced the decision in person. After that, he did not dare to say that there were objections and announced the dismissal of the court. He also needed time to arrange everything. For example, the number of concubines and children in the palace was quite a lot. The sudden move of the capital shocked many people. For example, most of the officials had bought a lot of properties in the capital. Those were things that could not be taken away. Now that the capital was suddenly moved, what were they going to do with those things? Those were immovable property that could not be taken away. Usually, when Nehru as the king made a decision, his subordinates usually did not dare to oppose it. After all, it would affect the dignity of the king of the country. However, when an order involved the interests of the majority, it was difficult to carry out the order even if it was given by the king. Just like in India at this time, the officials actually collectively opposed the move of the capital. So much so that the palace began to make preparations. However, the officials were stubborn and refused to budge. Time was wasted like this. Due to the failure of the government order, not only did it buy more time for the five-star army to arrive, it also caused the situation in India to become a mess. Nehru was indeed an ambitious and ruthless figure. Seeing that his officials did not listen to his orders, he angrily led the people in the palace and went straight to Vidal city, leaving more than 80% of the officials in Mumbai. Originally, he wanted to kill one or two of them to intimidate the others. However, he was afraid that if he really did that, it would cause internal strife and cause everyone to oppose him. So he had no choice but to do it. The king actually left, bringing only the members of the royal family and less than 20% of the obedient officials with him. When the news spread out, the officials became a little anxious. They were blaming themselves for pushing the king too hard. Should they lower their heads and follow the king when he left? State Preceptor Zhou Xian stood up and publicly said that moving the capital was an important matter for the country. How could it be done just like that? The king's action was mostly to throw a tantrum. As long as the officials did not leave with him, it would not be long before the king would definitely return. When the time came, everyone would collectively go forward and admit their mistakes and the matter would be over. The state preceptor's words struck a chord in the hearts of some people. For a time they followed him. As the state preceptor, Zhou Xian enjoyed a very high status in India. Now that he stood up and said these things, many people thought that they had found the root of the problem. As a result, even if the king left the capital, the officials still had no intention of following him. How would they know that some of Zhou Xian's actions had already incurred Nehru's dissatisfaction? Zhou Xian was the one who had previously prevented him from helping the Khaganate send troops. Because of this, Nehru had long thought of replacing him. If it were not for the change in the situation, George would have been arrested and punished by now. Nehru knew this, but the officials did not. So, after the king was gone, everyone instinctively followed the state preceptor's lead. However, others did not know, but as the state preceptor himself, Zhou Xian knew. Feeling that his position was in danger, in order to save himself, he took the initiative to look for Yonk this time. After a discussion, these words came out. Yonk, the former director of the Foreign Affairs Group of the Security Bureau, was transferred to the Central Asia region more than a year ago to serve as the branch director. His most glorious achievement was to instigate the rebellion of the famous General Chen Di of Jiaoxi Yunnan province, as well as Long Qi Higuang and others of the Lancang kingdom. Considering that he was good at this time he was entrusted with the position of the branch director of the Central Asia Region Security Bureau by Director Yang San. As soon as he came here, Yonk investigated a lot of information and selected some people who could be targeted. This state preceptor Zhou Xian was among them. Under his efforts, the greedy Zhou Xian really became good friends with Yonk. In front of a large amount of gold and silver, although he had vaguely guessed Yonk's identity, Zhou Xian did not mention it. He even helped him to do a big thing, which was to prevent King Nehru from sending troops to help the Khaganate alliance. It seemed that he was living off the Khaganate alliance, but in fact things like collusion with foreign countries were too common in history. Especially during the Warring States period, it was the most common thing. Often when one side could not defeat the other, they would find a way to deal with the other side. Then, there would be cases of troops retreating when they almost reached the capital of a country. In the end, Zhou Xian was the state preceptor, not the king. This difference of one word was the difference between a monarch and a minister. The monarch was permanent, but the minister could be changed. At that time, most people became officials only for money. Otherwise, there would not be a saying that thousands of miles became an official only for money. When Yonk took out something that satisfied Zhou Xian, he naturally had to speak up for him. In a way, the two of them could be considered friends. Nehru intended to take down Zhou Xian, the state preceptor. This was a friend in trouble, so Yonk should stand up and think of a way for him, which led to the current situation. Nehru did not know about this. He did not leave the capital in a moment of impulse. He wanted to force everyone to follow him. He was using practical actions to make everyone choose. This plan was feasible. Originally, there were already some ministers who wanted to follow, but because of Zhou Han's interference, everything turned into nothing. After knowing the reactions of the ministers in the city, Nehru was furious. He wanted to immediately cut Xiao Han into pieces. Men secretly informed the people in the capital to kill Xiao Han. Nehru knew that if Xiao Han did not die, it would be difficult for the ministers to move the capital, so he gritted his teeth and said fiercely. Nehru wanted to kill Xiao Han, but it was too late. Whether it was Xiao Han's wisdom or Yang's experience, how could they not have guessed this? They were already prepared. Not only did they change Xiao Han's residence, but they also increased the security around him by several times. In the next few days, there were no less than 4 or 5 attempts on Xiao Han's life. But under the tight security, even the assassins did not see the shadow of the target. Under the continuous assassination, Xiao Han was determined to follow the 5-star army to the end. Chapter 1544. If Jawaharlal Nehru were to win this battle, he would lose his head first. Xiao Han's cooperation made Skylark very satisfied. At this time, the 5-star army's navy arrived outside the port of Bombay. After the two discussed it, they decided to go all out and directly welcome the navy. Thus Bombay fell. Before the war even started, Bombay, the capital of India, was peacefully accepted by the 5-star army. How did this trick work? Everyone who saw it was confused. When the news reached the ears of Yang Chendong, who was leading troops into India, his face also changed color. After a long time he said, Good, I think Nehru's face must be darker than charcoal's. Seeing that Yang Chendong was in a good mood, Beta Persei on the side also said happily, Young Master Skylark and the Navy have asked for instructions. What should we do next? Do we need the Marines to land and cooperate with us? That's not necessary. Send a telegram to the world's first cavalry army and let Tian Hu send a division to take over Bombay first. As for the Navy, let them do what they should do. After all, the war at sea can't be neglected. It's not good to let them divide their forces. Yang Chendong said with a smile. Compared to the army which could attack Europe and Central Asia, the Navy could indeed extend its reach all over the world. Their task was more difficult. Originally, Lung Feng's military strength was somewhat insufficient. How could he borrow their strength? On the other hand, most of the land that could be conquered had already been conquered. After these things were solved, the next thing was the matter of the Great Ming Dynasty. Whether it was Baiming or the Great Ming Dynasty, it was time for them to give an explanation. Just as Yang Chendong thought, Nehru's face was really dark. It was not an exaggeration to say that it was as dark as the bottom of a pot. Before this, he had never thought that a mere subject, even if he held the position of the state preceptor, could he sell out the entire country? At this point it was useless to blame Xiao Han. However, he had to avenge the loss of the country's capital. He had already received news that the 5-star army's navy had evacuated from Bombay, leaving behind 10,000 5-star army cavalry. Since this was the case, he must take back the country. He wanted the ministers and people to see that as the King of India he had the ability to compete with the 5-star army. He called his confidant General Mathur and gave him 50,000 soldiers, of which 10,000 were cavalry and 40,000 infantry. He ordered him to rush to Bombay. In order to let the army be able to exert their maximum power over the course of the day and night. And there were many officials left in their way, and presumably, the wealth in their hands would not be small amount of wealth B's wealth was. However, he did not know if the enemy would fall for it. Would it be inappropriate? Could you please remove the word, no? The answer was obvious. He would definitely fall for it. This was because Mathur, who was leading the troops, did not know what was happening in the city. He got the news from his spies that everything in Mumbai was as usual. He did not see any reinforcements from the 5-star army, nor did he see any movements from the 5-star army in the city. Caution is the parent of safety. Order the cavalry to be at the back and the infantry to be at the front. Mathur was entrusted with such an important task by Nehru, so he naturally had a certain level of ability. He did not think that the 5-star army did not know about his arrival. However, the other party still did not do anything. This was somewhat thought-provoking. Before figuring out the true intentions of the other party, Mathur decided to be careful. He placed his cavalry at the back so that if something unexpected happened, he could change according to the situation. It was this move that saved Mathur's life. This was because at this time, Gong Feng had already surrounded them with 4 regiments of the world's first cavalry army. Who said that a small number of people could not surround them? With more people, there were still many mountains, forests and rivers in this area. Gong Feng had already dug a hole and was only waiting for the enemy to enter the hole before pulling in the net. The Indian Army was given another name by the netizens in the future. Indian Army. We all know that Indian Army likes to cheat and do some crazy things. In particular, their arrogance left a deep impression on people. It was like during a military parade, a motorcycle often carried dozens of people. If one said that it was a peacock spreading its tail, then it would be a shame to the beautiful peacock. At this time, although the Indian Army did not have the nickname Indian Army when it came to arrogance, they were not at all inferior. They were also very poor and arrogant. Their so-called 500,000 standing troops were just some civilian groups that were of moderate age but did not have any formal training. Perhaps in the eyes of many people, the younger troops were a sign of strength. Therefore, other than age, they could be said to be lacking in other aspects. Just like the weapons in their hands now, there were all kinds of weapons. There were long spears, long knives, long swords, short swords, and some wooden sticks mixed in. It gave people the feeling that it was a hodgepodge. However, such an army still had a complacent look. It seemed that no matter what kind of opponent they encountered, with their youth and strength, they could charge and win. They wore unlined clothes, and it was obvious that there was no cloth armor on them, not to mention armor. With such equipment, even Xianxia's local troops could not enter. Now that they were targeted by the elite of the elites, the 1st Cavalry Division, how could they have a good time? When night came, the Indian Army was still hurrying. This was not because they were very obedient, but because Ma Tuer, as the general of the army, had painted a big pie for them. After reaching Mumbai, they could loot for 5 days. It was this noble idea that made it impossible for them not to be faster. It seemed that if they were late by 1 step, they would not be able to get anything. This caused the formation of the Indian Army to be in disarray. Many of them were already panting heavily, but no one was willing to give up on the journey and give up on their dreams and goals that they couldn't achieve. In the forest beside the official road, Division Commander Gong Feng was looking at the scene in front of him with night vision binoculars. At first he was even a little dumbfounded. This was very different from what he imagined a regular army to be. At one point he thought that this was a trap prepared by the enemy for him to enter. After observing for a while, he saw that the last 10,000 cavalrymen were finally wearing cloth armor. Only then did he breathe a sigh of relief. Although cloth armor was the lowest equipment and was not in Gong Feng's eyes, at least there was a difference. Since the cavalrymen were wearing cloth armor, it was very reasonable for the infantry not to wear armor. Seeing the Indian Army enter his encirclement unknowingly, Gong Feng, who originally only had a 70% chance of winning, was now at least 90%. He couldn't help but wonder how the Indian soldiers would react when faced with a charge from a cavalryman clad in solid armor. Would they be defeated in one hit? Everything had to be done with facts. In the darkness, a bright red flash suddenly rose in the forest. In an instant, the dazzling light attracted everyone's attention. Thank you for the monthly tickets and rewards from Blazing Flame 3-inch nail. Thank you for G. Pingan's red packet reward. Again, I will solicit votes for Longzi's new book, Duke Fierce. Friends who pretend to be real can go and take a look. Longzi admits that he is very diligent. Thank you again for your support. If you still have a recommendation ticket or a collection ticket, please vote. This is very important for the new book. Longzi knows that everyone is supporting him and will be more diligent. Thank you. Military supply Deming will be completed soon. I will strive to update 4 to 3 times a day before the completion. Don't worry, no matter what happens, I will not stop updating. I guarantee a smooth completion. Thank you again for your support. Chapter 1545. The sudden appearance of the red light immediately attracted the attention of the 50,000 Yin soldiers. They were still wondering what it was and why it was so bright and beautiful. Suddenly, the sound of horse hooves could be heard from below their feet and into their ears. It's an ambush. Ma Tuer, who was riding his horse, also saw the red light. Instinctively, he had a bad feeling. When the sound of hooves entered his ears, his first reaction was that the enemy had arrived. He had not received any reports and there shouldn't be any cavalry from the 5-star army nearby. So where did this commotion come from? What was going on? With 70% confusion and 30% doubt, Matur followed the sound and looked forward. What he saw was the chaotic scene of the army formation. The 5th Heavenly Cavalry Division had attacked. The red signal flare was the order to launch an all-out attack. A total of 4 regiments, totaling 8,000 cavalrymen, charged out from all directions, charging towards the Indian infantrymen on the main road. Before they even arrived, the Big Dipper crossbows in their hands were already activated. As the arrows rained down, the Indian soldiers who did not know what was going on were met with a barrage of attacks. He didn't greet them, nor did he challenge them to a fight. The first thing he did was launch an all-out attack. As the crossbow bolts rained down one after another, cries of agony could be heard coming from the Indian soldiers who were dressed in simple clothes. This was the biggest difference between having armor and not having armor. In some dynasties, in order to not suppress the bravery of the commoners, the officials allowed them to carry weapons or self-made crossbows. However, they would definitely not be allowed to carry armor. Just from this point alone, one could see the difference between having armor and not having armor. On the battlefield, even when faced with a rain of arrows, soldiers with armor had a 30% chance of survival. Even when facing an opponent, they could still be injured in 4 or 5 places before dying. However, soldiers without armor did not have such ability. Usually victory or defeat would be decided in a single exchange. The Indian soldiers without armor were completely defenseless against the Big Dipper crossbows at close range. Initially they thought that this would be a good mission. They only needed to rush to Mumbai and attack the city with their advantage in numbers. By then there should be reinforcements from the city. By then the city gate would be breached under the pincer attack from both sides. By then it would be time for them to reap the rewards. Who would have thought that they would run into enemies halfway through their journey? Moreover, it was when they were extremely tired. At this moment, facing the crossbow bolts from afar, even if some people wanted to turn around, they couldn't do so. Not to mention the 5-star army's cavalry seemed to be everywhere. They didn't even know which direction to run to. They were like headless flies. Other than being helpless and dying, they didn't know what to do. In the future, when tens of thousands of Ming soldiers faced thousands of Jianyu soldiers, they would be defeated in one blow. In the future, when tens of thousands of Ming soldiers faced hundreds of Japanese soldiers, they would also frantically retreat and throw away their cannons. This was enough to prove the difference between elite soldiers and mediocre soldiers, as well as the difference between good equipment and plain clothes. Just like now, facing the fully armed soldiers of the world's first cavalry army and facing a sudden attack, the 40,000 Indian soldiers did not even have the chance to resist and were thrown into chaos. In the battle, there were countless people who died from being trampled. In the end, someone shouted, "Abandon your weapons and kneel on the ground. Those who surrender will live." In the dark night, black figures knelt on the ground one after another. Their movements were so orderly that it was as if they had rehearsed it hundreds of times. Compared to the incompetence of the infantrymen, the performance of the cavalrymen was slightly better. However, it was only slightly better. Under General Matur's orders, they even launched a counterattack. However, it was obvious that their cloth armor could not block the arrows from piercing through their bodies. However, what was even more unexpected was that when the battle was at its climax and the Indian cavalrymen still had the advantage in numbers, Matur, who was leading the troops, actually led the 1,000 or so cavalrymen to escape. This was because he could not see any hope of victory. In addition, in the dark night, he did not know how many 5-star army soldiers there were. He was very worried that if he continued to fight, he would lose his life here. As such, he might as well just leave. The fact that their general had escaped was a huge blow to the Indian cavalrymen. In addition, the 5-star army's cavalrymen seemed to have an endless supply of arrows. In the end, they also chose to surrender. 8,000 against 50,000. With the advantage of equipment and combat experience, the battle was over in just over 6 hours when the sun rose. At this time, the Indian soldiers realized that there were less than 10,000 of the 5-star army soldiers surrounding them. However, at this moment they no longer had any weapons and were like meat on a chopping board. They could not muster up any will to resist. When evening came, Division Commander Gong Feng led the army back to Mumbai with 30,000 Indian soldiers. This scene was witnessed by the common people in the city. They did not know when the 5-star army left the city, but when they saw that only a few thousand cavalrymen were able to escort tens of thousands of Indian soldiers into the city, many of the common people's faces turned gloomy. Their own army was so weak that it caused the little bit of pride in their hearts to diminish. After Ma Tuer's army was defeated, he returned to Vidar city 3 days later. He cried and complained about the shamelessness of the 5-star army. He even exaggerated that 70 to 80,000 5-star army cavalrymen surrounded them and set fire and arrows on them. In the end, he was unable to turn the situation around and killed his way back. King Neru's face was naturally filled with anger. He cursed Ma Tuer's incompetence in his heart. He did not believe that there would be any 5-star army cavalrymen around Mumbai city. However, considering that they were in dire need of manpower, if he really killed Ma Tuer, it would inevitably cause panic among the other generals. In the end, he only reprimanded Ma Tuer and allowed him to take the blame. In the eyes of the other generals, Neru displayed the image of a benevolent king. Everyone praised him endlessly. The rest of the generals expressed that when they encountered the main forces of the 5-star army, they would definitely risk their lives to repay the king's kindness. In the eyes of Neru, all of these made him very satisfied. He took the opportunity to announce that he would send out 300,000 soldiers and set up a defensive line in front of the Godavari River. For this, he even took out the cannons and guns he bought from the Westerners and put on a look that said he would take care of whoever came. However, no matter what, after Madal's defeat, Neru's thoughts of splitting up his forces had been resolved. He could be considered to have completely given up on the vast land north of the Godavari River, and instead used a passive method to wait for the 5-star army's arrival. Time passed quickly. Half a month later, Yang Chendong brought the main forces of the 5-star army to Mumbai city. Outside the city gate, Division Commander Gong Feng held a grand welcoming ceremony. When the 5-star army entered the city one after another, the neat marching formation and the excellent equipment were displayed one by one in front of the Indian people. Some people who originally wanted to wait for the king to come back unknowingly gave up on that idea. The troops just entered the city normally, but some people's thoughts of resistance were extinguished. At this point, Yang Chendong had fully understood and used what was called creating momentum. Over the years, he had also become better at using the people's hearts and using momentum to achieve what he wanted. The army only stayed in Mumbai city for 2 days. After a short rest, they went out of the city and went straight to the Godavari River. Neru was waiting for a decisive battle. How could this not be what Yang Chendong wanted to see? Although the Delhi Sultanate had been attacked in the Battle of Myanmar and had to withdraw 20,000 troops, the pressure there had been reduced to a certain extent. But after all, the war was still going on. Every day that was delayed would cause the development of the Delhi Sultanate to stagnate. If he could settle the matter of India earlier, he could send troops to help. In comparison, if he could have a decisive battle with the Indian army earlier, he would not delay it by a day. Tian Hu, the commander of the 1st Cavalry Army, and Su He, the commander of the new army who had rushed to the Godavari River, had already reported that the Indian army had placed many cannons on the opposite side of the Godavari River. They even saw nearly 10,000 flintlock soldiers. This was the main reason why they had no choice but to stop the charge. It was just that this defensive formation was naturally a great existence in the eyes of the cavalry. But in Yang Chendong's eyes, it was really nothing. Comparing firearms, his Lung Feng was definitely at the ancestral level. When the 2nd and 4th divisions heard the news, they were also very excited. When they found out that the other party also had firearms, they really wanted to see for themselves. Compared to the cold weapons that were charging at them, they preferred to destroy firearms. It seemed to bring them more glory. In their excitement, the army moved very quickly. In just 5 days, they had reached the opposite side of the Godavari River. At the same time, the heavy cannons and other weapons in Leng Feng's hands arrived as well. The 5-star army had finally arrived. Neru, who was in Bidar city at the rear, was also the first to receive the news. From this moment on, he became a little anxious. Although he had spent a lot of money to buy these firearms, how good were their performance? The power of these firearms had yet to be tested. At the same time, he also knew that the 5-star army also had firearms. He just did not know who would be more powerful when the two sides met. Just as Neru was feeling anxious, on the morning of the 2nd day after the 5-star army arrived, the 2nd and 4th divisions of Lung Feng began to move. 75mm field cannons were pushed out from the army, constantly moving towards the Godavari River. During the meeting in the tent last night, Yang Chendong had introduced the range of the cannons to everyone. They could only fire about 3 li. Although these cannons were considered decent weapons back then, in the eyes of Lung Feng they were really not enough. As the soldiers of Lung Feng pushed the cannons forward, they were naturally filled with confidence. They only stopped when they were about 3.5 li away. Chapter 1546. They were both using cannons and exploding shells, but the range of the cannons was 6 li. The distance of the cannons was more than twice that of the enemies. The outcome of the battle had already been decided before it even began. Everyone pay attention. Once the enemy's cannons are destroyed, it will be time for our cavalry to charge. At that time, everyone must seize the opportunity to cross the river. The first to reach the other side will be given the highest merit. As the various divisions and commanders pushed forward with the cannons, they also mobilized their soldiers. According to the battle plan Yang Chendong had laid out last night, bombarding the enemy's firearms was only the first step. The most crucial step was to cross the river and fight. If they couldn't do that, it would only be a small victory. For this reason, the officers of the various armies and divisions who had accepted the mission mobilized their troops to chop down all the trees in the vicinity as soon as the sun rose. They made simple wooden bridges so that they could cross the river at any time. This time, those who followed Yang Chendong were all veterans who had been on the battlefield. Many of them were no longer afraid of war. On the contrary, because of Yang Chendong's emphasis on military merit, many of them were excited as if they had been injected with chicken blood. They were afraid that there would be no war to fight. That would make all the skills they had learned useless. It could be said that it was precisely because of this powerful security system and the establishment of military merit awards that the 5-star army would not develop a battle weariness even when they were fighting everywhere. It wasn't easy for them to rely on war to live a good life. How could they dislike war and give it up in the end? With their fighting spirit and high morale, coupled with the strongest equipment and the most powerful firearms, who could stand against them? When the cannons were pushed to the front of the Godavari River, only 1.5 li away from the Indian cannons, the 2 divisions and 400 cannons stopped. Following that, boxes of cannons were pulled up by horses and mules. The cannons were opened and the cannons were dismantled. The preparations for the cannons were done in an orderly manner. On the other side of the Godavari River, many of the Indian generals saw all of this. Ma Tuer, who was trying to redeem himself, even estimated the distance between the two sides. When he confirmed that it wasn't within the range of the cannons, he could only shake his head helplessly. Then he looked at the 5-star army on the other side of the river. He wanted to see what the Han army was going to do. At the same time, he would occasionally glance at the rear of the army. Due to his previous experience of being defeated by the 5-star army, he had formed a 20,000-man inspection team. If anyone dared to take a step back during the battle, they would be treated as deserters and killed without mercy. It was precisely because of this preparation, coupled with the danger of the Godavari River in front of them and the firearms and cannons on the side, that Tuer felt a bit more confident in this battle. Last check: reload the cannons in 3 minutes. As the commander of the Lung 2nd Division, Xiao Feng's experience came into play. This time he became the commander of both the Lung 2nd Division and the Lung 4th Division. In the following time, the cannoneers quickly checked the cannons. When there were no problems, the soldiers picked up the cannons and prepared to reload at any time. Xiao Feng turned around and after confirming that there were no problems, his expression turned serious. As he shouted for the cannons to fire, the small red flag in his right hand fell down. Instantly, 400 cannons fired at the same time towards the other side of the Godavari River. There was no test firing, nor was there any calibration. There were simply too many Indian soldiers on the other side of the river. Looking from afar, it seemed as though there was no end to the number of tents. With so many targets, it was impossible for the cannon to miss. Xiu xiu xiu. Xiu xiu xiu. The cannons let out a pleasant sound as they pierced through the air and landed on the Indian camp on the other side of the Godavari River. Some landed on the enemy's cannons, some landed among the gunners, and some landed among the archers. There were even some that landed beside the tents, uprooting them one by one. With a loud bang, the orderly Indian camp was replaced by a cloud of smoke. Cries and screams could be heard from the camp. The cannons landed with a loud bang and a ferocious force that greatly exceeded the expectations of the Indian soldiers. When many of them were hit by the cannons, their bodies were smashed to pieces, or they were injured by the aftershocks of the cannons, losing an arm or a leg, The camp was filled with the cries of ghosts and howls of wolves. Ma Tuer, who was riding on his horse, was also frightened by this scene. His warhorse also shook its head and wagged its tail because of the loud explosion. If he did not control it with all his might, it would have already turned tail and fled. Calm down, calm down. Facing this sudden change, although Ma Tuer's face was pale, he still did his duty and shouted, "Immediately order the cannons to fire back." Although he knew that the distance was not enough, Ma Tuer could not think of a better idea. If they didn't do anything, the army wouldn't be far from collapsing. The order was given to the cannons, and the cannons at the front started to reload. One cannonball after another was loaded into the cannons. Then a loud explosion sounded and the cannonballs landed on the 5-star army across the river. The sound of the cannonballs brought hope to the Indian soldiers. Many of them were looking at this scene, hoping that their cannons would succeed. Boom, boom, boom. Boom, boom, boom. The sound of cannons rang out and landed about 200 to 300 meters in front of the 5-star army, creating craters one after another. However, that was it. With the limited range, these cannons could not harm the 5-star army at all. Destroy all the cannons. Fire. Xiao Feng's face was cold. Although the enemy's cannons could not harm him, the sound of the cannons was a provocation to him. Since they dared to fire back, he would not be able to recognize his parents if he did not beat them up. He would not be able to live up to his position as a division commander and the 2 golden badges on his shoulders. Compared to the other division commanders of the Cold Front who had the title of Major General, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Division commanders were all lieutenant generals. The sound of cannons being fired rang out once more, the target being the Indian cannons. Amidst the earth-shattering sounds, more and more cannons became the targets of the Indian cannons and were blasted into smithereens. The soldiers were also blasted into the sky and there were countless casualties. Without the threat of the enemy's cannons, the 400 field cannons of the 5-star army took turns moving forward. They needed to extend their firepower and prepare for the other armies to cross the Godavari River. With the extension of the cannons, the Indian army that thought they were safe became hell. Even Ma Tuer had no choice but to retreat. However, his gaze was fixed on the Godavari River. He believed that after the cannons fired, the 5-star army would force their way across the river. That would be the moment when the two sides clashed. That would be the time for him to counterattack. The sound of the cannons continued to ring out. It was as though the cannons did not cost any money. The other 5-star army also used this time to start building the pontoon bridges. The Godavari River was not very wide. It was less than 2 miles wide. The most important thing was that the river was not deep. The shallowest part was only a meter deep and the deepest part was only 3 meters deep. Furthermore, the river was not turbulent. Under such conditions, the 5-star army only needed to follow their usual training and build the pontoon bridges. By the time the giant logs were laid down one after another to form a bridge, it was already more than 4 hours later. With the combined efforts of 30,000 soldiers, the first pontoon bridge was completed. Following that, the 2 regiments of the 2nd Regiment and the 4th Regiment became the first batch of soldiers to cross the bridge. They held on to their Type 95 rifles and various heavy and light machines. They carried enough ammunition and rushed to the other side of the river. Very quickly they established the first line of defense. With just one pontoon bridge, it was unknown how long it would take for an army of 200,000 to cross. Thus, the 2nd and 3rd pontoon bridges were quickly constructed. Compared to the difficulty of the first pontoon bridge, the subsequent construction was much faster. They could build both pontoons at the same time. In the end, they only needed to connect the pontoons. The main focus of the 5-star army was still on the pontoon bridges. This gave the Indian army a chance to counterattack. Mader, who had been waiting for this opportunity, immediately gave the order for the entire army to charge forward. Not only did they have to blast the 5-star army into the river, they also had to destroy the pontoon bridges. This was also the only chance for the Indian army to turn the tables. As long as they did not allow the 5-star army to cross the river, they would be in an invincible position. Behind them were the 20,000 soldiers of the inspection team, who were staring at them like tigers watching their prey. To the majority of the Indian army, they could either stand there and wait for the cannons to blast them to pieces or charge forward and chase the 5-star army back. Without any other choice, more and more Indian soldiers chose to take the initiative to attack. In their eyes, this was not only a matter of luck. If they did well, they could even earn merits. It was the only way for them to survive. In the blink of an eye, more and more Indian soldiers launched their counterattack. They held on to all sorts of weapons and shouted out various slogans to boost their courage. Some of them even tore off their clothes, leaving their upper bodies bare. It was as though they were fighting to the death. With so many people charging forward, the aura they exuded was shocking. If it was a cowardly person, they would have already trembled and not know what to do. However, for the battle-hardened soldiers of the cold front, such a small battle was nothing. On the contrary, with so many military merits in front of them, everyone's eyes lit up. Their fingers involuntarily reached for the trigger. Chapter 1547. Everyone, don't be impatient. Let's get closer before fighting. As the commander of the 4th Division, Ling Daqiang's eyes were shining as he spoke. Unknowingly, he had already picked up a light machine gun and was ready to shoot. 800 steps, 700 steps, 600 steps. The Yin army was getting closer and closer. Those with good eyesight could even see the ferocious expressions on their enemies' faces. However, this did not affect the mentality of the cold vanguard soldiers at all. They all remembered the main points of their training, held their breaths, and adjusted their breathing to ensure that they could hit the target more accurately when they fired later. 400 steps, 300 steps, 200 steps, 180 steps. At this distance, it was guaranteed that the 95 style would be able to unleash its greatest power. At this moment, Commander De Chong finally shouted, "Everyone fire!" Da-da-da. The impatient soldiers of the 5-star army raised their guns and started firing. Countless bullet casings jumped out of their guns and landed beside them. Countless bullets flew forward and hit the Indian soldiers who were charging at them. Puff puff puff. Thump thump thump. Clang clang clang. Under the sounds of gunfire, more and more Indian soldiers were shot dead, falling on the path of the charge. However, the Indian army didn't seem to have any intention of stopping. They were still holding onto their swords, spears, swords and rods as they shouted loudly. They looked like they wouldn't give up until they achieved their goal. Yang Qindong, who was riding on the white dragon, was also moving forward with the army. Through the binoculars he saw everything that was happening. At this moment his heart suddenly trembled violently. He seemed to have seen the scene at Bali Bridge in the late Qing dynasty. Countless Mongolian cavaliers and green camp soldiers roared as they tried to charge into the Anglo-French army's formation. However, they were shot down from their horses halfway. They were enough to use the last bit of courage of that dynasty, using their last bit of strength to win, even if there was only a trace of hope. However, it was useless. Under the intense gunfire, as long as one was not a god, they would not be able to break through this deadly blockade. It was the same for the Indian army. As they charged forward, many of them fell down. Then they continued to charge forward and fell down. However, there were simply too many Indian soldiers charging at them. There were at least 100,000 of them, and each formation consisted of 1,000 to 2,000 soldiers. When there were nearly 100 formations charging at them, even the 8,000 cold vanguard warriors could not stop them from advancing even if they continued to fire. Rocket launchers, get ready. Fire. Seeing the ferocity of the Hindustanis, Ling Daqiang was not afraid. Instead, he was delighted. He liked opponents like this who knew they were going to die but still charged forward. It was much better than those who peed their pants at the sound of gunfire and tried to escape. At least this time they could enjoy themselves to their heart's content. Thump thump thump. Boom boom boom. The rocket launchers of the various regiments launched their attacks. When the rocket launchers crossed a distance of 100 meters and landed in the midst of the Indian soldiers, a single blast would clear out a large area and cause a large number of Indian soldiers to fall down involuntarily. Some of the rocket launchers could even cause about 100 casualties. This was all because the Indian soldiers were too close to each other. The 400 field cannons at the front also began to retreat. After retreating to a certain distance, they landed their cannons within 200 steps of the river. The cannons landed amongst the charging Indian soldiers, causing a large number of casualties. Under the alternating sounds of cannons and gunfire, the area between 80 and 500 steps of the Godawali River was quickly filled with corpses. A rough estimate showed that there were no less than 30,000 people dead. This was the damage done in less than 2 hours. Under such a powerful attack, the Indian soldiers' charge was finally stopped. When they saw that they could not get close to the five-star army no matter how hard they tried, more and more Indian soldiers started to feel afraid. It was a matter of course that people would die in a war. Anyone in the army would have to make plans and preparations in this regard. However, it was not what everyone wanted to do, to die without any hope of victory. When they realized that they would die if they charged forward, some people started to hesitate. Why did they have to rush forward to die, while their comrades behind them could watch all of this from afar without being harmed in the slightest? Without comparison, there would be no emotions and no disappointment. When they realized that the faster they ran, the faster they would die, some of the Hindustanis slowed down on purpose. Some of them even turned around and ran back. That's right, there were 20,000 inspectors behind them. But what if they could break through the blockade of the inspectors? Those people did not have such perverted killing weapons like the five-star army. This gave them the courage and opportunity to try. Another quarter of an hour passed, and the Indians threw down another 10,000 corpses. De Chong and the rest of the soldiers were shocked to find that there were no more opponents in their sights. All the Indian soldiers began to run back and started to fight with the inspectors who were looking at them from behind. Don't worry about them. Load your weapons and get ready to fight at any time. Ling De Chong only took a glance with his binoculars and ignored the Indian soldiers. After giving the order, he turned around to check on the construction of the pontoon bridge. That's right, 2 pontoon bridges were about to be completed in 2 hours. Could be imagined that more and more cavalry would arrive. That would be the time for them to charge. On the Indian side, the 20,000 inspectors killed countless Indian soldiers. It was only when Ma Tuer sent another 10,000 reinforcements that the situation stabilized. At this moment, there were less than 40,000 Indian soldiers standing in front of them. In other words, 20,000 Indian soldiers had died in that short period of time. Charge back. As long as you charge back, you will have a chance to survive. Otherwise, even if you die, your families will not be taken care of. Ma Tuer knew that the morale of the Indian soldiers was unstable. However, in order not to disappoint the king, he could only grit his teeth and persevere. Charging back meant death. Not charging back meant death. The only difference was that if one died, their families would be taken care of. However, the Indian soldiers had no choice but to turn around. Or rather, it should be said that they had changed their direction. To them, the weapons in their hands were no different from fire sticks when compared to Lung Feng's muskets. In fact, they were even inferior. They're here again. Seeing that the sky was about to turn dark, the Indian army turned around and prepared to charge at them again. Xiao Feng chuckled and said with a sense of satisfaction, "Cheer up, it's time for us to reap the harvest. Commander Xiao, give us a chance." Just as the 4 regiments of the Cold Front soldiers were prepared to fire at any moment, the commander of the 1st Cavalry Army, Tian Hu, and the commander of the new army, Su He, arrived behind Xiao Feng. Although the 3 of them held different positions, they were all lieutenant generals. In terms of status, they were about the same. Therefore, they were very polite when they spoke to each other. When the 2 commanders spoke to Xiao Feng in unison, he also felt a trace of pressure. What? Have the armies of the 2 commanders already crossed the river? Xiao Feng asked, not answering the question directly. He noticed from the corner of his eyes that the cavalry soldiers were still crossing the river and had not started to gather. No, but it will take at most 15 minutes for them to cross the river. They don't need to gather to charge. By the way, Commander Xiao, as you know, the construction of this place will require a lot of manpower. Even if they are all moved away in the end, many families can't live without men. Thus, it's better to capture as many captives as possible. Tian Hu urged his horse forward and spoke with a sincere expression. Tian Hu's words were not his own analysis. They were words that Yang Chendong had said in public announcements more than once. As the commander of the Cold Front soldiers and an extremely senior person, Xiao Feng naturally knew this was the truth. He could continue to kill the enemy, but it would be bad if he delayed the 6th young master's plan to rule the country. After lowering his head and thinking for a while, Xiao Feng finally raised his head and said, "All right, you guys hurry up and cross the river. Before you officially enter the battlefield, if the Indian soldiers attack, we will have to fight them back." This meant that Xiao Feng had agreed. Once the cavalry entered the battlefield, they would stop fighting. Upon hearing this, Tian Hu and Su He couldn't help but nod. They were impressed by Xiao Feng's ability to see the big picture. "All right, thank you, Commander Xiao. We are all working for the 6th young master and for the development of our people. This is what I should do." Xiao Feng chuckled and returned to his commanding position. As the commander of the 2nd Division of the Cold Front, he had a firearm in his hand. His every move was watched by many people. This was especially so when he interacted with other commanders or division commanders. He didn't want to be noticed by others because he wasn't paying attention. Even if the 6th young master didn't doubt his loyalty, it was inevitable that there would be people who would gossip behind his back. If that was the case and someone reported this to the 6th young master, he might have to resign from his position to avoid trouble. Xiao Feng saw everything clearly. After he finished speaking, he turned around and left. Tianhu and Su He looked at each other, cupped their fists and left as well. Since Xiao Feng could see through it, how could they not understand the logic behind it? Since ancient times, generals with great power were easily suspected. They wouldn't make mistakes just because they weren't paying attention. As soon as Xiao Feng returned to his commanding position, he saw a large group of Indian soldiers charging towards the river. They were less than 700 steps away from the cold front. As usual, shoot when they are 300 steps away, Xiao Feng said casually. Xiao Feng casually said this as he took the light machine gun from the guard's hand and began to inspect it. Left with no choice, the 40,000 Hindustanis chose to continue charging forward. Chapter 1548. They knew that rushing forward would most likely result in death, but they had no other choice. General Mader obviously wanted to use them to consume the ammunition of the 5-star army. The only thing they could do was to be a somewhat useful live target. Knowing that they would die, most of the Hindustanis simply threw away the weapons in their hands. To them, in the face of firearms, there was no difference whether they had weapons in their hands or not. Since that was the case, they might as well die in a relaxed manner. A total of 40,000 people walked forward step by step in a densely packed formation. Some soldiers even held hands with each other. It seemed that only by doing so would they not be so lonely on the road to the underworld after death. Even though the sky had already darkened, there were still people moving about in the vast and mighty army of 40,000 people. These were all human lives. Even though they were of a different race, many of the Cold Front warriors still couldn't bear to see this happen. Even Beta Persei and the others who were standing in the middle of the army seemed to have the same thought. Many of them even deliberately looked at Yang Chendong, who was riding on the white dragon. Perhaps they wanted their master to be merciful to their opponents. How could Yang Chendong not feel the gazes of these people intentionally or unintentionally looking at him? But his heart was like a boulder and did not waver in the slightest. He would never forget how the Hindustanis in the future rebelled against China. When you were needed, you could say anything. When you were not needed, you could be as cruel as possible. Looting, burning, and killing were all kinds of evil, but their country did not care. Instead, they allowed such things to happen. Because of this, many outstanding Chinese people suffered losses in this matter, and even lost their lives because of it. Since there was a chance now, of course, he would not let these people live, let alone let history repeat itself. Give the order. Unless you kneel down and surrender, you are the enemy. You know how to treat the enemy. After Yang Chendong said this, no one dared to say anything else. Some smart ones had already run to the front to pass the order. In fact, there was no need to give any special orders. Since Yang Chendong did not give any new orders, they would just follow the same old routine. Therefore, before the messenger could cross the river and reach the front line, the 5-star army had already opened fire. The vanguard of the 40,000 Hindustanis was already within 300 paces, and under the full force of their firepower, wave after wave of Indian soldiers fell to the ground. After being shot, some of the Hindustanis even had a look of relief on their faces. Perhaps this way they would no longer have any worries. The gunshots did not stop, and the casualties of the Hindustanis continued to increase. Under the heavy firepower of the Lung Feng soldiers, no one could get within 100 steps of them. Most of them were shot dead between 300 and 200 steps. This phenomenon continued until a quarter of an hour later, when the most elite cavalry of the 5-star army had already crossed the river. Then, without waiting for the formation to be completed, the two commanders, Tianhu and Su He, commanded the cavalry to charge forward, one on the left and one on the right. The moment the cavalry charged, the Lung Feng soldiers stopped shooting. In just a short while, bullets had already fallen to the ground beneath their feet. Now that they no longer had to shoot, many of the soldiers began to massage their arms. It was obvious that shooting was a strenuous job and it was very tiring to shoot for a long time. Charge. Those who drop their weapons and kneel down will live. Tens of thousands of the 5-star army's elite cavalry charged, and the battle cry rang out everywhere. They shouted in the Hindustani language that they had just learned. In fact, it was just a Hindustani language to force the enemy to surrender, and it was not difficult to learn. Just a moment ago they were still facing firearms attacks and suddenly the enemy changed tactics. Many of the Hindustanis widened their eyes and they did not know what to do. It was true that infantry was at a disadvantage against cavalry, but it was not to say that they did not have a chance. But when they wanted to fight back they found that the weapons in their hands had been thrown to the ground at some point. At this time, how could it be so easy to find them in the dark? Run! Seeing that the Han cavalry was getting closer, many of the Hindustanis' faces changed. To them they would rather be killed by a flintlock. At least they would die a quick death. However, if they were hit by a warhorse, it was very likely that they would not die immediately. Instead they would have to suffer a lot. This was not what they wanted. The tens of thousands of Hindustanis were all panicking, and the originally orderly formation became very chaotic. Everyone turned around and ran. It was as if whoever was a step slower would suffer the pain of being trampled by 10,000 horses. In such a chaotic environment, how many people would seriously listen to the 5-star army's slogans to surrender? Due to the cavalry's charge, the battlefield became even more chaotic. This greatly exceeded the expectations of Grand General Matu Air behind him. He did not deny that the infantry was sent to exhaust the 5-star army's ammunition. He had seen the firearms that his king bought from the west, and he knew that it required a lot of gunpowder to fire. Once there was no gunpowder, the gun was no different from an ordinary stick. He hated the fact that the 5-star army appeared and destroyed his artillery and firearms. Otherwise, he would not have to use manpower to exhaust bullets in exchange for a chance to win. However, who would have thought that the gunshots would stop? Just when he was thinking that the 5-star army's gunpowder was about to run out, he suddenly saw the black shadow rushing back. Not only that, the ground under his feet began to tremble. What's going on? After Matu Air exclaimed, he instantly thought of a possibility. Then he said in shock, "Not good, the 5-star army's cavalry has already crossed the river. They are charging. Come archers, where are the archers? Prepare to counterattack." As he shouted, Matu's eyes revealed a hint of joy. Although the cavalry was not easy to deal with, it was still better than the untouchable firearms. Once the Han cavalry's momentum was restrained, perhaps his opportunity would come. For example, he could push the enemy back and then take the opportunity to lead his troops to charge. With the Han cavalry's cover, the 5-star army's firearms would not be able to fire casually. This would create an opportunity for him to rush to the river. This sudden turn of events had indeed caught many of the Indian generals off guard. But after hearing the great general's shout, many people calmed down from their panic. Then many of the soldiers picked up the bows on their backs and prepared to counterattack. In the dark there was a limit to the accuracy of a bow and arrow. Unless it was a godly archer, the arrow that was shot out would most likely fly off to who knows where. Fortunately, they had enough soldiers. When the rain of arrows fell, even Meng Yi would be able to deal a heavy blow to the 5-star army's cavalry. It was a good idea, but they forgot one thing. That was, in front of the 5-star army's cavalry, there were still tens of thousands of their own troops. Even though they had been suppressed by Lung Feng for 15 minutes, there were still more than 30,000 people. This was not a small force. Because they did not want to be trampled to death by the cavalry, their retreat not only made it difficult for the archers to shoot, but also caused them to charge back into their own camp, causing even more damage. It was not a bad idea, but it had already become a reality. Under the pursuit of the cavalry, under the heavy sound of iron hooves, the Hindustanis desperately ran back. Even when they reached their own camp, they did not have any intention of stopping. Perhaps they did not want to be trampled to death, or perhaps they wanted to return to their own camp to seek reinforcements. But no matter what, they still charged back, causing damage to Matu Air's defense and the archers' counterattack. It's a success. Everyone extend the cannons and bring out those mortars as well. With the help of the binoculars, Yang Qindong saw the Hindustanis frantically running back and his own cavalry chasing after them. Although he could only see a rough picture in the dark, with his many years of experience he believed that it was a success. Soldiers were defeated like a landslide. This was the scene in front of him. Once the situation on the battlefield became irreversible, even if they wanted to, it would be impossible to reverse the situation. When Beta Persei heard that they were going to use the mortars, how could he remain calm? He immediately agreed, turned around and rode away. Not long after, the rumbling sound of cannons could be heard. This was not the self-made field artillery of the 5-Star Army's military factory, but the sound of a 100mm mortar. In comparison, it could hit a distance of more than 10 miles and could kill people. The shells landed behind the Hindustani army, causing great damage and completely disrupted Matu Air's previous arrangement. He always thought that a 6-mile bombardment was the limit of the 5-Star Army. He thought that the place where he was standing was very safe. But who would have thought that there would be such powerful cannons? Seeing that the rear of the army had also been hit by the cannons and was in chaos, he said with a sorrowful expression, "Retreat, retreat all the way back to Vidal City." The Hindustani army, who had been in a passive position, finally admitted defeat under the great power of the mortars and the 5-Star Army's trump card. Fortunately, Matur was decisive in his actions. Under his decisive command, 100,000 of the 300,000-strong army managed to escape back into the city. And this battle had basically crushed the Hindustani army's will to resist. The sky was finally bright. At this time, under Yang Qindong's command, the army basically joined the battle. But because the Hindustani army was already in a mess and had no strength to resist, most people were just capturing captives. The battlefield was big enough, there were enough enemies, there was a language barrier and very few people cooperated. The capture of captives actually took 2 days and 1 night. It was not until noon on the 3rd day after the battle began that the battlefield basically stopped. Yang Qindong looked at the report that had just been sent to him. In this battle they had killed more than 70,000 enemies and captured nearly 130,000 enemies. He knew that the Hindustanis were about to be finished. Chapter 1549. In Bidar city, General Matur led the defeated army back to the city, and Nehru was shocked when he heard the news. That was 300,000 people, even 300,000 pigs couldn't be slaughtered so quickly, right? Although Matur had brought back 100,000 people, it still made Nehru very angry. He had hoped that the 300,000 men would hold off the 5-Star Army, and once the stalemate reached a certain point he would look for an opportunity to counterattack. Now he had lost 2/3 of his soldiers, and with the soldiers in the city, there were only 25 men left. How long could they hold off the 5-Star Army? Nehru was furious and the consequences were severe. In front of all the generals and ministers he ordered Matur to be executed. Matur didn't resist at all. He had fought the 5-Star Army twice in a row and had lost twice. He no longer had the confidence to win against the Hans. Since that was the case, so be it. Death was release. After Nehru killed Matur, he personally took command. He wanted to bring the 250,000 soldiers in the city to fight a decisive battle with the 5-Star Army in Bidar city. This was also a national war. During this process, some people suggested that they should send people to negotiate with the 5-Star Army. At most, they would surrender to the other party and respect the other party as their suzerain. There were also people who suggested that they should continue to retreat. They could retreat to Gabaja city. If that didn't work, they could retreat to Bangalore. Speaking of which, India's territory was not small. However, these 2 points were rejected by Nehru in the end. Surrendering was impossible. He understood that in front of the 5-Star Army, there was only the possibility of annihilation. There was no such thing as peace in exchange for surrender. Since they were going to be annihilated no matter what, they might as well give it a try before they die. As for retreating, where would they retreat to the day after tomorrow? Doing so would only cause the morale of the army to drop, and they wouldn't have a chance to fight the final battle. To be able to become the king of Hindustan, Nehru wasn't a coward. On the contrary, he was someone with great ambition. He was determined to fight the 5-Star Army. He wanted to see how strong the other party was. For this, the first thing Nehru did was to boost the morale of the army. He announced the wealth he had brought from the capital to the public and explained how much money and benefits one could get from killing an enemy on the battlefield. This kind of open and transparent reward system had indeed boosted morale and stirred up the hearts of the people. In just 2 days, the 250,000 Indian soldiers in the city seemed to have been reborn, and some of them even showed signs of longing for war. On the 5th day, Yang Chendong led the main force of the army and appeared outside Vidal City. When he learned that King Nehru did not escape, but was prepared to fight to the death with him here, he was naturally very happy. He liked to fight because it simplified complicated matters. It could buy him more time. And in order to fully respect this opponent, he was determined to show his ability, such as using the Air Force. He didn't try to understand the situation in the city. Although there were spies from the intelligence department in the city, they weren't equipped with radios and couldn't spread any news. And even without the support of intelligence, Yang Chendong could imagine that since Nehru didn't intend to leave, he must have made ample preparations and was waiting for Yang Chendong to attack the city. Since that was the case, let's see who's more powerful. On the first day outside the city, the Air Force couldn't take off due to the heavy rain. Yang Chendong endured for an entire day, which further boosted the morale of King Nehru. He shouted arrogantly that the 5-star army wasn't invincible, and they were probably afraid of his army. This boosted the morale of the 250,000 soldiers in the city by a large margin. In such a situation, without the support of advanced weapons, it was really impossible for the 200,000 soldiers of the 5-star army to take down Pidal City. In ancient times, the existence of a strong city would often deter the enemy. Sometimes, in order to take over a city, it was possible for the enemy to surround it for a few months, half a year, or even longer. That was also why the wise monarchs in ancient times had the desire to expand their territory, but were often unable to do so. But in Yang Chendong's eyes, all of that was nothing. The reason why he was able to lead his army to conquer such a large territory in just over a decade was because of the advantage brought by the large warehouse. He had advanced weapons that were far superior to those in this world, which was the greatest weapon that made him invincible and invincible. If it weren't for the fact that he didn't want to kill indiscriminately and that he needed to leave a lot of people behind to build his homeland, he could have formed an Air Force helicopter brigade, tank brigade, and war chariot brigade. Just think about it, if he took out those things, who in the world would be a match for him? This was especially true for those large caliber cannons that could shoot up to tens of kilometers, hundreds of kilometers, or even more. If he really let them unleash their might, the enemy would often be destroyed before they even knew what they looked like. Yang Chendong did not do that. What he needed was to conquer, not destroy. At the same time, he also needed a powerful army for his use, not an army that only knew how to use the advantage of weapons to fight weak enemies. If that was really the case, what kind of combat power would this army have when he was no longer around? He did not use his strongest ability because he did not need to. Even if he did not use his strongest weapon, he could still conquer one country after another in a very short time, expand his territory, and instill the idea of Han supremacy in the world. Now that he had come to India, it was only natural that he wanted to occupy this place. From then on, India would perish and this country and race would no longer exist in the world. From then on, there would no longer be any incidents of Indians rebelling against China. Before he conquered this place, he did not mind teaching them a lesson, making them remember him forever, so that they would tremble at the thought of the 5-star army, and lose their will to resist. When he thought of doing that, he had to deal them a heavy blow. Therefore, on the morning of the third day, when the sky cleared up and the sun hung high in the sky, the Air Force set off with an order. Over 100 hot air balloons soared into the air above Bidar city. At this time, on the city walls of Bidar, countless Indians were waiting in formation. Beside them, there were many temporary wooden huts. They were all made up of huge wooden sleepers, which were the preparations they had made to defend against the cannons. From the words of the 100,000 defeated soldiers, they knew that the cannons of the 5-star army were extremely powerful, and had a long range as well. Mater had lost in this aspect. Nehru came up with such a method after learning from the mistakes of his predecessors. Although it could not completely suppress the power of the cannons, at least when the cannons were fired, there would be a place to hide. Perhaps they could not avoid being injured or dying in battle, but it was better than nothing. When he thought that he had done all this, he would have the ability to compete with the 5-star army, or at least have the ability to fight a protracted war. But when he heard the exclamations of the soldiers and saw the hot air balloons that had appeared above the city without him knowing, he was still shocked. What are these things? Nehru did not know, nor did he know what they were used for. But his intuition told him that these things must be very dangerous. After all, being able to fly in the sky was already a breakthrough in the thinking of many people. Because of the backward science, the ancients had always been in awe of the heavens. Before they could figure out whether the earth was round or square, the heavens were always in existence that they had to worship. But now there were actually people who could fly in the sky. Just this statement alone made the eyes of many Hindustanis show fear. Although the stimulation of wealth did not cause any chaos, it was obvious that the morale of the army was greatly affected when they saw the hot air balloons floating in the sky. Although they did not know what these things floating in the sky were, they knew that they did not have these things, but the Han people did. As soon as the hot air balloons appeared, it attracted the attention of all the Hindustanis in the city. Not only were there 200,000 soldiers, but there were also more than 1 million civilians in the city. India was a large country with a large population at that time. As one of the largest cities in the country, Vidar city had long had more than 1 million civilians. This was also one of the reasons why Nehru was so confident. In his opinion, with so many civilians, as long as he did not suffer a crushing defeat, he could rise again at any time. Under the eyes of millions of people, the hot air balloons arrived above Vidar city. Then a large number of wooden barrels filled with black oil fell from the sky like a fairy scattering flowers, falling toward Vidar city. Countless wooden barrels fell, but to the Hindustanis who did not know the power of the black oil, this did not make them feel anything. They only instinctively dodged. However, when the wooden barrels fell to the ground, a large amount of black oil poured out. Following that, many fire extinguishers fell from the sky and started a huge fire. That kind of scorching feeling and that kind of threatening fire caused many people to become alarmed and cry out loudly. Some of the kerosene fell on the city tower of Vidar city, and the fire immediately burst into flames. One after another, people shouted to put out the fire. The soldiers began to put out the fire with basins of water. This primitive method of putting out the fire naturally had no effect on the kerosene. Not only that, but the fire also became more vigorous in a short period of time because of the water. Many Hindustani soldiers were caught off guard and were burned by the fire, causing even more miserable screams. On the city tower, Nehru, who was protected by countless palace guards, stared at the scene in front of him with wide eyes, and his body trembled involuntarily. Chapter 1550. He knew that the 5-star army would have cannons to pave the way, and he was prepared to sacrifice some of his men. However, he believed that in the end the siege still depended on people. As long as they could hold on until the 5-star army was blocked outside the city, it would be considered a victory. Under such a series of attacks, when both sides suffered casualties, the scales of victory would slowly tip towards him. After all, he was the king of India. If he was in trouble, the soldiers of other cities would not leave him in the lurch. Especially when they saw that he was in a stalemate with the 5-star army, the possibility of them sending reinforcements would greatly increase. When that time came, the 5-star army would not have any reinforcements. At that time, even if 2, 3 or even 5 people were sacrificed, the final victor would still be him. This was the reason why Nehru persisted until the end. He firmly believed that with the advantage of nearly 10 million people, he would definitely be able to drive the 5-star army out of the country. However, he never expected that the other party would start a fire, and it was the kind of fire that could not be extinguished at all. Perhaps the fire would not hurt many people, but the impact on the morale of the army was unimaginable. When all the soldiers lost their fighting spirit because of the fear of the fire, the 5-star army would charge at the right time. Who would be able to stop them? For this battle, he took out all his assets to reward everyone and raise the morale of the army. However, all of this was based on whether they could win and survive. And if they died in battle, what was the use of all the wealth? At this moment, Nehru finally felt fear. He did not know if the 5-star army had any other means that they had not used yet. Just a big fire had already left him at a loss. What would he do if there were other ways to attack? The fire continued to light up in the city and could not be extinguished. Anyone who came into contact with the flames would either die or be seriously injured without exception. It did not take long for the city to turn into a living hell. On the other hand, the 5-star army outside the city had no intention of attacking the city at all. On the contrary, they set up a formation to prevent the Hindustanis from launching a counterattack in desperation. After that, they began to cook. It didn't take long for the aroma of meat to drift into Vidal city. If it was any other time, the aroma of the meat would definitely make the Hindustanis, who could not even fill their stomachs, swallow their saliva. However, at this moment all of them were vomiting non-stop. There was no other reason other than the fact that many people in the city had already been burned to death and turned into roasted meat. The smell they emitted was actually not much different from the smell of meat. How could it not make people want to vomit? Young master, when do we attack? Beta Persei asked curiously as he watched the fire burning everywhere in the city. Don't worry. This Neru clearly wants to fight us to the death. How can we let him have his way? Let's burn it for a few days first. Yang Qindong had a confident smile on his face. What he wanted was to exchange the greatest victory for the smallest price. He wanted to see how many more days these Hindustanis could last. Yang Qindong was neither in a hurry nor slow. He had no intention of attacking the city at all. Every day he ordered the Air Force to drop black oil barrels into Vidal City. The fire was put out again and again, and after 5 days of this, the city that had been bustling with life had turned into scorched land. Wails and cries could be heard everywhere. Not only did the fire burn many Hindustani soldiers and civilians to death, but it also ignited the piles of food that were originally stored in the city. The water source was also greatly damaged due to the fire. Seeing that it would not be long before the city fell into a situation of food and water shortage even if the 5-star army did not attack the city, Neru's face turned pale. He finally experienced the feeling of helplessness in the face of the 5-star army. He finally understood why the alliance army of nearly 1 million Khanates, which seemed so aggressive and powerful, would still be defeated by the 5-star army. This was an army that did not play by the rules, but at the same time they had many trump cards up their sleeves. When faced with such an opponent, it was often impossible to guard against them. It was only natural that they would lose in the end. Your Majesty, our rations can only last for another 10 days at most. We don't have much water left. If this goes on we... Finally, one of the generals asked Jawaharlal Nehru in a doubtful tone. Kill those who incite the army's morale. Nehru did not even look at the general. He just waved his hand. Immediately, the palace guards rushed forward and beheaded the person who spoke. When the other ministers and generals saw this scene, they all shrunk their necks. Nehru wanted to use this method to tell everyone that there was only one path for them to take, and that was to resist to the end. As for those who had other thoughts, they should all go to hell. A general died because of one wrong sentence. This made the others not dare to say anything even if they had other thoughts. They could only hope that the reinforcements would appear or a miracle would happen, and the 5-star army would take the initiative to retreat. It was impossible to make the 5-star army retreat. Since they came with such a large force, how could they retreat without destroying the Hindustani royal family and occupying this place? As for the reinforcements, no one was a fool. The strength of the 5-star army was there for all to see. Unless one had enough confidence, who would easily get involved. What was the difference between that and taking the initiative to die? Days passed and the fire continued to burn fiercely. Every day the Air Force would come to Bidar city. Regarding this, the Hindustanis in the city went from being terrified at the beginning to being indifferent towards the end. They were used to it. But if one looked carefully, one would see that whether it was the soldiers or the civilians, all of them had a look of despair on their faces. Obviously they were all prepared to die. They could not see any hope of survival. Ordinary soldiers and civilians would accept their fate. Or rather, their lives were cheap to begin with. If they died, then so be it. But the ministers, nobles and generals in the city did not want to die. They had families. Some of them had wives and many children. How could they be willing to die just like that? Under the strong pressure, King Nehru's authority was no longer an existence that could suppress everything in their eyes. It was no longer an existence that made them tremble in fear. This was especially so for some of the more knowledgeable officials. The news that they received was that whenever the 5-star army conquered a country, they would not kill anyone for no reason. On the contrary, those who surrendered and submitted to the Han people could still live with 1/10 of their wealth. They just needed to move to another country. When this news was spread by the secret agents of the intelligence department in the city, and the nobles and people in power knew about it, some people were finally moved. Seeing that if they continued to resist they would only die. They were unwilling and decided to save themselves. The so-called saving themselves referred to surrendering to the 5-star army and seeking a way out for themselves. If they wanted to do this, they had to overthrow the mountain in front of them. King Nehru. Maybe the strength of a minister was limited, and the strength of a general was far from enough. But when everyone joined forces, their strength became very shocking. Under the silent collusion, more than 90% of the people in power had been united. In 1466 AD, in the 6th month, when Nehru was still sleeping, his subordinates rebelled and fought with his guards. In the end, Nehru personally went up and was killed in a chaotic battle. Along with King Nehru being killed, the generals and ministers who took over opened the city gates of Bidar and India surrendered. In the same month, Yang Qindong personally gave the order to establish the India province. The governor was the former 1st Cavalry Army 5th Division Commander Gong Feng. Considering that only the royal family of India was destroyed, there were many cities and armies that had not surrendered. As such, the Second Army was established. The commander was appointed by Governor Gong Feng, and the former Second Army Nyodua was under him. Gong Feng was appointed and quickly promoted. Apart from the fact that this person was indeed capable, as he was an all-rounder, which made Yang Qindong feel assured. Another important reason was that other senior officers were not willing to take on this position. For example, Tian Hu, the commander of the 1st Cavalry Army, was used to fighting and killing, especially the feeling of fighting with Yang Qindong. Letting him become the commander of the army seemed to be a promotion, but because of this he was fixed in one place. This was something he was unwilling to do. There was also Wu Xing, the commander of the 3rd Army, who also had this qualification. But a few years ago he was thrown in Eastern Europe for 10 years. Those days were really hard. Facts also proved that he was a tiger general, not a good minister who ruled the country. There was no need to consider it. Finally, a new commander of the 3rd Army like Su He had enough experience and was brave enough to fight in the war. These years of military merit had already allowed him to join the Han nationality and become one of their own. But he was just a martial artist. He did not know many big words. Counting on him to revitalize and build a place, then forget it. In the end, it was Gong Feng's turn. Although this person did not even have the experience of being a commander, he was now directly appointed as the commander of the army. The promotion was a bit too fast. But don't forget, he was Yang Qindong's student. Whether it was loyalty or ability, he was a top-notch person. Since he had such an advantage, no one could say anything if he was promoted faster. Therefore, this heavy responsibility fell on Gong Feng's head. After receiving the appointment, he knelt in front of Yang Qindong with tears in his eyes. While thanking Yang Qindong for his kindness, he also said that he would do his best to pacify the whole of India, and then seize the time to build and strive for self-sufficiency as soon as possible. He would do his part to strengthen Yang Qindong. At the end of June 1466 AD, King Wunan of Daimyong Yang Qindong led the main army out of India and went straight to the city of Lahore in the north. Chapter 1551. Sultanate, Delhi. When the news of the Indian King Nehru's men being killed and the 5-star army occupying the heavily defended city of Bidar without sacrificing a single soldier reached Delhi, King Lodi was truly terrified. The way he saw it, even if the Indian army was no match for the 5-star division, they would at least be able to hold on for a few years. That way he would have sufficient time to make preparations. Whether it was recruiting a new army, expressing goodwill to the Han people, or even choosing a place to escape, there would be a path he could take. Who would have thought that the seemingly strong Indian army would be so weak that they would be completely wiped out in just over half a year? Even King Nehru himself couldn't protect himself and was killed by his subordinates. With this lesson in mind, Rodi was extremely fearful of the 5-star army. He was even more afraid that he would be betrayed by his subordinates and be beheaded when the enemy's soldiers arrived at the city gates. After careful consideration, he handed over the letter of surrender before the 5-star army could attack him. He was willing to hand over the entire Delhi Sultanate to King Wunan of Daimyong. He only asked for a place to spend his remaining years in peace and for the other party to spare his army and people. By the time Yang Qindong arrived at Lahore after spending nearly 2 months, the Sultan's letter of surrender had also arrived. Yang Qindong of course accepted it with a smile. He then led his army straight into the Sultanate and entered the capital of Delhi. Outside the city gates of Delhi, Rodi changed out of his royal robes and wore the plain clothes of a commoner. He knelt in front of the city gates and handed over the king's seal and the tiger-moving seal to Yang Qindong in front of all the officials and commoners. He stayed in Delhi for 5 days and comforted Rodi. He also said that he would send him to Xianxia city, where the weather was pleasant and the living facilities were good. It was the best place to spend his remaining years in peace. After that, he met with some of the officials in the country and won over many of their hearts. In the 9th month of 1466, he led the main force of the army out of Delhi, passed through Kanauj-Jabuna River, and arrived at the border city of Benares. His army then arrived at the border city of Sadpur in the Barangi kingdom. At this time, the nobles of Bengal were also panicking. India was destroyed and the Delhi Sultanate surrendered. The situation had changed so quickly that it was beyond their expectations. If it was half a year ago, who would have thought that the five-star army would be so powerful that even the barriers behind them, India and the Delhi Sultanate, which they thought were the safest, had been taken down one by one? Now, Bangla, who was originally at the rear, had become the front line. They had to face the five-star army head-on. Did they have the ability to do so? Before the main force of the five-star army could do anything to Sadpur city, two different voices were heard in Dhaka city. One wanted to surrender while the other wanted to fight. Most of them were descending. It was clear that Bangla, with a population of less than 3 million and an area much smaller than India, was truly afraid. They might be able to take advantage of the fact that the five-star army was not paying attention to them to take advantage of them. However, when the five-star army treated them like a piece of cake and wanted to deal with them, their fear would appear in their bones. As the King Abdul's power was not completely centralized, the power he inherited from his father Mardin was not complete. There were even some voices in the country that looked down on him. Him sending troops to Myanmar was also a means to divert everyone's attention. He hoped to use this opportunity to win a few battles to lay his foundation and let everyone know that he was not inferior to his father. On the contrary, he was even stronger. His train of thought was correct. Usually, a new king would use some external methods to settle internal matters and achieve the goal of centralizing power. However, the bad thing was that they should not have chosen the five-star army as their opponent. Now that they had attracted the attention of this lion, even Abdul was afraid. After learning that the Sultanate had surrendered, Abdul immediately wrote a letter to General Rajiv, who was fighting in Burma. He explained the situation at the rear and asked him to ask for help from the great Ming dynasty's third provincial king, Zhou Xian. No matter what, he had to help him. Otherwise, with Bangla's strength, he would not be a match for the five-star army, who had the strongest firearms. Unfortunately, after writing the letter, it was like a stone sinking into the sea. There was no reply. It was not that Rajiv did not inform Zhou Xian. Instead, it was that Zhou Xian could not even protect himself. How could he have the strength to support Bangla? Previously, the matter of the two sides working together to divide the Yang faction's territory seemed like a joke now. Perhaps Abdul trusted Zhou Xian too much and fell for his trap. He attracted such a powerful enemy like the five-star army. It could be imagined that since they were the ones who made the first move, it was time for them to return the favor with a kick. It was just that Xianxia's territory was big and his strength was strong. He could take a few kicks like nothing happened, but Bangla was too small. How could they withstand a kick from the five-star army? Tell Zhou Xian that if he doesn't send reinforcements, I will also surrender to the five-star army like the Sultan. At that time, I will also tell King Wu Nan of the great Ming dynasty about his previous promise. He can just wait to be burned by the flames of anger. Abdul, who was furious, said sternly to the newly sent messenger. He just wanted to put on a threatening appearance. If he did not do so, he was afraid that Zhou Xian would not help him with all his strength. But what Abdul did not expect was that this threat would cause him to lose his life in the end. On the 7th day after he sent out the new emissary, a group of relatively short and serious people came from outside the palace of Bangra. When they appeared at the back door of the palace, they were welcomed in. The palace that was usually tightly guarded was now like an open park in front of these people. There were no secrets to be kept. That night, it was these people who changed into night clothes and quietly appeared outside King Abdul's palace. In the night, these people moved like lightning and were as swift as the wind. The 20 palace guards waiting outside were not even a match for these people in black. In less than half an incense's time, they were all killed. When the leader of the black-clothed people appeared beside the king's bed, Abdul seemed to have sensed something and slowly opened his eyes. "Who are you? Who are you?" When he opened his eyes, he saw a black figure standing in front of him. Out of instinct, Abdul could not help but exclaim. But after that he felt a chill on his neck. It was as if something was flowing out of his body. Then all the strength in his body began to be sucked away bit by bit. Abdul was dead. He died on his bed. Along with the queen, her personal maids and dozens of guards. The king died from an assassination. It was only in the middle of the night when another shift of guards came to take over the shift. Once this was out, the already anxious people of Dhaka city became even more chaotic. In the middle of the night, the entire palace was brightly lit. Many people were shouting to catch the assassins. But obviously they did not even know the exact time of the king's death. How could they catch the assassins? And in less than an hour, a group of black figures left the palace. When they left, the leader of the black-clothed people stopped in his tracks. His eyes revealed a cruel and smug smile. Under the moonlight, one could see a pair of small triangular eyes. If Yang Qindong was here, he would definitely recognize him. He was one of the special ninjas of the Japanese Empire who was on his death list. Satpur City. When Yang Qindong led the 5-star army to the city, the general guarding the city sent out a messenger. The general idea was that the king intended to surrender, but what should he do? He still needed to discuss with the ministers, so he needed some time. He hoped that the 5-star army could wait for a few days. Facing the messenger, Yang Qindong did not feel anything wrong. India was destroyed just like that. The king of India died because of it. Then the king of Delhi Sultanate surrendered. Now it was Bangla's turn. It was reasonable for them to choose to surrender. Yang Qindong could understand the situation. He told the messenger that he could wait for a few days. He didn't even threaten the other party to not play any tricks. Facing the 5-star army who had absolute strength, delaying the battle for a few days wouldn't have any effect. So he wasn't worried that the other party would play such tricks. It should be that Abdul really needed time to discuss with the ministers. After all, the surrender of a country was not a small matter for a country. While waiting, 7 days passed. Satpur city's defense became even tighter. There were also many soldiers on the city tower. Although they knew that their arrows couldn't hit the 5-star army's camp 5 miles away from the city, the soldiers still drew their bows and put on an attitude of, "If you dare to come, I dare to shoot." The situation suddenly became tense. This naturally didn't escape the eyes of the scouts. When the situation was reported back to Yang Qindong, he was also confused. He couldn't understand why Bangla's soldiers suddenly became tough. Could it be that they have something to rely on? This doubt was quickly solved. Just like the intelligence personnel in India, the intelligence personnel in the small country of Bangla also didn't enjoy the treatment of having a radio station. So they used people to transmit the news, which made the news less effective. But in the end, the result was still in front of Yang Qindong. Abdul was assassinated. The king of a country was assassinated. It was no wonder that the soldiers of Bangla were so nervous. Who did it? After seeing this news, Yang Qindong's always confident eyes flashed with ruthlessness. Chapter 1552. The assassination order was definitely not given by him, and without his order no one would dare to do it. Moreover, to assassinate the king of a country in a heavily guarded palace without being discovered afterwards was not something an ordinary person could do. Even in the entire Xianxia, even the spies of the intelligence department's action team couldn't do it. Only people like the Wolf Fang Special Forces, who have been specially trained in beheading operations, could do it. Of course, the high-level ninjas of the Japanese Empire could also do this if they had an insider. In Yang Qindong's eyes, without his order, these two armies wouldn't dare to act without orders. Then who could be the murderer? What good would killing King Abdul do to the person who did it? Yang Qindong, who was puzzled, was really puzzled. This sudden incident was not as simple as the killing of a king. At least, it showed that there was a dark hand behind the scenes that he couldn't see or didn't know about. Since they had the ability to kill King Abdul, then could they also pose a threat to his safety? Of course, Yang Qindong was now at the level of a grandmaster, and he had Okura's protection. Unless someone could kill him in an instant, there would be no chance. But this didn't mean that his family would be safe. Beta Persei, immediately send a report to Yang Wu and ask him to increase the security level of the Rezin City Palace. Although he didn't think of the reason, it was necessary to take precautions. Understood. Beta Persei also thought of something and his expression changed drastically, then he turned and went to the telegraph office. Yang Qindong was left alone in the tent and he was silent for a long time. With Okura's help, there was really no one in the world that could make him feel afraid. If there was one, it would be the people in the dark. Because such a person, you don't know who they are, what kind of means they will use, and what kind of method they will appear in front of you. If he made a mistake and fell into the other party's trap, he would have to pay a heavy price. This was especially true for his family and children in the palace. If any of them were hurt, Yang Qindong would not be able to accept it psychologically. In his previous life, he was an orphan. Other than the military and he had no other relatives. But in this life he had these family members, so as a man he had to protect them well. Anyone who wanted to harm them would have to go through him first. Otherwise, if they suffered any losses, even if he found the culprit and tore him into pieces, it would be too late for regrets. It would not be enough to make up for everything. Who? Yang Qindong, who had been sitting for a long time, slowly stood up. He had already decided to let Yang San investigate this matter personally. At the same time, he had also arranged for the members of the Langia Special Forces to be hidden outside the Palace of Resin City as an extra layer of insurance. At this moment he suddenly felt like there was a dagger at his back. But no matter what kind of feelings he had, the problem of Bangla still had to be solved. Their king Abdul was assassinated. Presumably, everyone would think that he was the culprit. If that was the case, it would be impossible to reclaim this place peacefully. After all, how could the five-star army, which even their king could not tolerate, gain the trust of Bangla's officials and generals? Since peaceful means could not solve the problem, then they would fight. Fight until the opponent was afraid, until the opponent surrendered, until Bangla was destroyed. They were the ones who attacked Xianxia's Myanmar province first. Now it was time for them to pay the price. If they were not convinced, then they would fight until they were convinced. If they did not surrender, then they would fight until they surrendered. The death of King Abdul could not stop the advance of the five-star army. Early the next morning, the 2nd and 4th divisions of the Cold Front Division were fully armed and arrived at the outskirts of Satpur city. When they were 3 miles away, the cannons roared and shells whizzed through the air towards the 5 city towers. After a round of cannon fire, the city walls collapsed. Using this opportunity, the 1st Cavalry Army and the new army's elite cavalry attacked from the left and right respectively. Satpur city fell. This battle seemed to be very easy. But that was only because of the advantage of the firearms. In fact, it was not that there was no resistance at all. For example, when the 2 cavalry armies charged into the city, they encountered a lot of resistance. Especially after entering the city, there would be people shooting arrows from the dark corners from time to time. Because of this, both cavalry armies suffered casualties, especially the new army. Just after entering the city, the number of soldiers killed and injured exceeded 2,000. For the new army, this was already a defeat. Such a large number of casualties made them too ashamed to face anyone, let alone report the losses to Yang Qindong. But how could Yang Qindong, who always had full control of the army, not know? After listening to Beta Persei's report, he only replied with a cold expression, "Understood." Although it seemed like there was nothing else to say, in the following siege battle, the artillery fire of the Cold Front Division became even fiercer. Not only that, the Air Force was also used. Fire burned the various cities belonging to Bangra. It was as if wherever the army went there would be wails, corpses and scorched earth. This was Yang Qindong's revenge for the resistance of the Bangra people. Weren't you willing to shoot arrows from the back? Fine, I won't even give you the chance to do so. When are you going to blow up the city and burn it again? Only when you have no place to hide will we enter the city. Not only that, along the way the Bangra generals who resisted the five-star army were all skinned alive and wrapped in grass. No matter if it was a dead general or a living general, it was the same. In this battle, the five-star army had shown their cruel side, completely changing the image of the Han people in the eyes of others. They were magnanimous and kind. Yang Qindong never showed mercy to his enemies. Yang Qindong always said to everyone that if one repaid evil with good, how would one repay good? If you are not kind, I will not be righteous. If you can do it on the first day, I will do it on the 15th day. In the end, let's see who is afraid. The kindness of the Han people had always been given to those who had the intention to correct their mistakes and were kind-hearted. As for those kind and black-hearted jackals, forget it. Against them, Yang Qindong had plenty of hunting rifles in his hands. Regarding Yang Qindong's decision, None of the generals in the army objected. Firstly, they were used to seeing life and death and knew that being kind to the enemy was being cruel to oneself. They knew that if the enemy was not eliminated, it would be harmful to oneself. Secondly, this time it was Bangra who attacked Myanmar first, so it was time to teach them a lesson. It was like when someone punched you, but because of the limited strength, the punch did not kill you. Now that it was your turn, of course, you had to use as much strength as you could. Thirdly, which was also the most important point, everyone trusted Yang Chendong. Over the years, his position and authority in the army was unchallenged. His words were like the truth and everyone was used to obeying. With the above 3 points, Yang Chendong's orders were naturally carried out with all their might. However, just because the army did not have any objections, it did not mean that the civil officials did not have any opinions. For some reason, this matter spread to Xianxia city, as well as some other provinces under Xia's control. It attracted the opposition of some officials and a few scholars. In their view, the Han people were the masters of the world. Since that was the case, they should have a tolerant attitude towards their friends. Especially those who had not been enlightened, they should be more reasonable. Once they knew the etiquette, they would not go against the Han army. What's more, this time it was April who was assassinated first. As his subjects, it was normal for them to retaliate. These rumors were also gathered by the intelligence department and reported to Yang Chendong. This made Beta Persei, who was on the side, curse on the spot. These scholars, to think that they keep talking about those who know the truth and the sage's principles. Don't they even know right from wrong? That bullshit King Abu was not killed by us at all. He was about to surrender. How could we kill him? It was obvious that someone was trying to frame him. How can these people be the accomplices of a villain? Yang Chendong agreed with Beta Persei's words. It was impossible to say that he was not angry. He was fighting and killing on the front lines, risking his life at all times to bring glory to the Han people and let them live a good life. Now they had taken advantage of him and were still acting obedient. What magnanimity, they really did not know fear. With anger in his heart, he curiously looked at the list of names from the intelligence department. He wanted to see who was on it and who he was familiar with. Not to mention the list, he really saw a few familiar faces. For example, the Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Ethnic Affairs, Dong Chuanfu, and the Deputy Director of the Ministry of Grain, Yen Lianshui. These two people, because their positions were not low and their positions were very important, their names left some impression in Yang Chendong's heart. As for the others, he didn't care. They were just some unknown names that couldn't arouse his interest in the slightest. The list also recorded some of their opinions. The most important thing was that they were the Celestial Empire and were a country of etiquette, so they should help some small countries. How could the army do such a cruel thing? Yang Chendong only laughed coldly at this. In his eyes, these people were not real scholars. From Yang Chendong's point of view, a true scholar was not only a scholar who could write essays and recite poems, but also a person whose essays were creative and thoughtful. Moreover, they were also people who had humanistic feelings and social sciences. Moreover, real scholars were people who were the most serious, full of a sense of justice, and who cherished their own reputation the most. Jumping out like a group of jumping clowns, belittling others to elevate themselves, pretending to be virtuous, fishing for compliments and looking down on others, such people could not be called scholars. They could only be called a group of arrogant and shameless pseudo-scholars. Chapter 1553. Thinking about it, they were quite pitiful. Because they had low self-esteem, were reclusive and were not accepted by the world, they could only use such claptrap and lowly methods to attract the public's attention. If it was just to attract the public's attention, Yang Chendong was not willing to comment on it. He had a lot of things to do in a day, and there were also a lot of things that needed to be decided by him. He did not have the time and energy to pay attention to these people who did not have a strong sense of existence. However, they should not have attacked the military. This touched Yang Chendong's bottom line. Yang Chendong's way of ruling the country was not complicated. Could even be said that it was somewhat simple. In order to better manage the areas under his rule, he would give the civil officials great power. He only needed to divide the work. As for the more detailed work, he would let the people under him do it. He only needed to wait and see the results. If the results were good, he would continue to use them. If the results were not good, or if it proved that the person was not capable, he would just replace them. Sometimes he would even indulge the civil officials. This was a form of respect for them and also a strategy to manage the country. After all, the civil officials were important. As long as they were given what they needed, these people would work hard for him. This could solve many of the troubles of a monarch. He could indulge the civil officials, but there was one thing that no one could touch. Even if it was an important official or an indispensable existence in the eyes of others, it was still not allowed. This matter was related to the transfer of military authority in the army. Looking at the history of the dynasties, the reason why the founding monarchs were always at the same level was because they enjoyed the supreme ability to transfer military power. In the later years of the dynasty, due to various needs of balance, the monarchs had to give up military power and began to play all kinds of tricks with the civil officials. By doing so, it seemed that they could hold great power and know everything about the country. However, if they neglected the importance of military power, the final result was that the civil officials could control the military. Once they met a strong opponent, they would not even have the power to fight back. Moreover, a monarch who did not hold military power could not gain the respect of his subjects. After all, if he did not have any means to intimidate them, why should they be afraid of him? Yang Chendong, who understood this principle and saw through its essence, firmly grasped the military power in his hands. In this way, he had the power to change the situation at any time, hanging a sword of Damocles over the heads of the civil officials. As such, they had no choice but to obey. Not only did Yang Chendong do this, but his descendants also had to do this in the future. In this way, they would not have to worry about the collapse of the country. Even if something irreversible happened, at least they would have the ability to protect themselves. With such understanding and deep thinking, how could Yang Chendong change his decision just because of the clamor of some scholars? Since the policy had been set, it would not be easily changed. Not only that, Yang Chendong did not intend to let go of those scholars who were clamoring and picking on him. Not to mention that he was a person who would not rub sand in his eyes, but he was still able to distinguish between right and wrong. What? You're eating my salary and living in the house that I built. How dare you come back and criticize me? With Yang Chendong's authority and influence in Xianxia, they were already so presumptuous. It could be imagined that if his descendants were in this position, they would be even more rampant, right? If it was a more cowardly heir, wouldn't he be eaten by these so-called scholars? If he did not find something for these people to do and let them know that the horse lord had 3 eyes, he was afraid that such things would only happen more and more in the future. Beta Persei, send a telegram to City Lord Zhou Xian and Yang Wu. Pick out the people on the list and let them form a temporary diplomatic group. Allow them to go to the camp of the king of the 3 provinces, Zhou Xian. Also tell them that I can do as they say without using a sword or a spear. Then I need them to influence the king of the 3 provinces, and let them urge and force Zhou Xian to surrender unconditionally immediately. Otherwise, no one can guarantee what the consequences will be. Beta Persei took notes with a pen at the side, but as he wrote, he laughed out loud. This was clearly a means for the young master to deal with these scholars. It was simply impossible to make the other party surrender unconditionally. The king of the 3 provinces, Zhou Xian, who had hundreds of thousands of soldiers, was not the kind of person who would wait for death. If he was, he would not have harmed his eldest brother and 3rd brother to seize power. However, in Beta Persei's view, this was a good thing. Who asked those scholars to criticize the army when they had nothing better to do? Did they really think that they were in the Ming dynasty? Did they really think that they were those imperial censors who could make a rumor about anything, and even if there was an accident they would not be blamed for it? Now I'm asking you to negotiate with Zhou Xian, the person who killed his brother. If you have anything to say, you can say it to him. But remember to be careful. Don't provoke the other party and end up angering him. If that happens, even the gods won't be able to save you. When Beta Persei was trying hard to hold back his laughter, Yang Chendong spoke again. Send a telegram to Deputy City Lord Luan Shaochen. Tell him to keep an eye on this matter. If anyone on this list dares to not go, they will be stripped of their official position and will never be employed again. Their descendants will also not be able to be officials for 3 generations. Yang Chendong was worried that these people would play tricks when they saw the real move, so he came up with such a punishment system. Don't underestimate these so-called scholars who boasted of being virtuous and virtuous. Pick out one of them and put them in the future, they would all be at the level of emperors. Especially when it came to pretending to be dead, they were all top-notch experts. they didn't set some bottom lines, they would really come up with all kinds of tricks. The telegram flew straight to Crimson City and soon appeared on the desk of the City Lord of Crimson City, Zhou Xian. Not only that, but Deputy City Lord Luan Shaochen and Yang Wu of the Yang family also received the same telegram. The telegram was made public and had no intention of keeping it a secret. In just half a day the news had spread everywhere. Dong Chuanfu, who was named in the telegram, had a gloomy expression on his face. In his office, Yan Lianshui, the deputy director of the grain department, was crying and complaining with tears and snot running down his face. Elder Dong, they clearly don't see eye to eye with us. They think we're talking too much and want to make an example out of us. As our leader, you must speak out against it. I don't want to face the king of the 3 provinces. I heard that this person even killed his brothers. He's a demon king. Yan Lianshui fully displayed his acting skills as an award-winning actor. His face was full of pitiful and tears flowed freely from his eyes. Those who didn't know would think that he had suffered a great grievance. When he said this, Dong Chuanfu's face became even uglier. What did he mean by being the leader? He wasn't going to take the blame for this. Thus he said coldly, Deputy Director Yan, pay attention to your status. This matter was voluntary from the beginning to the end. No one forced anyone, let alone being the leader. After this reminder, Yan Lianshui realized that he had said something wrong and quickly corrected himself. Yes, Elder Dong is right. We were willing. However, our intentions were good. We didn't want to see the 5-star army brutally kill people. There's nothing wrong with this. Now you want us, the civil officials, to persuade the king of the 3 provinces to surrender? This is an impossible task. Perhaps we won't be able to return. Elder Dong, you are someone whose city lord you personally wrote a letter to invite. You have a lot of face, so you must report this matter truthfully. Humph. This time, Dong Chuanfu didn't say anything to refuse. He was indeed summoned by Yu Qian from the Southern Ming dynasty. At that time he was just an unsuccessful 7th-rank imperial censor in the Southern Ming dynasty. He was getting older and older and was about to die. At this time Yu Qian sent someone to deliver a letter to him. He thought about the current situation and saw that Bugnam of Gojoseon was going to replace the Great Ming dynasty. Thus, he made the decision to join the Southern Ming dynasty and become the deputy chief. In reality, it wasn't just Dong Chuanfu. In the entire Xianxia dynasty there were many people like him. They were all invited by Yu Qian or their colleagues who had been officials in the Great Ming dynasty. However, these people had a common characteristic. Whether it was in the Southern Ming dynasty or in Baiming, they were the type of people who weren't used in important positions. Otherwise, they wouldn't have abandoned their families and come to the Xianxia dynasty. After all, in the eyes of many people, the Great Ming dynasty was the orthodox. Dong Chuanfu, who was personally invited by Yu Qian, was very proud of himself. Relying on this, even the head of the Ministry of Ethnic Affairs, his immediate superior, was rarely in his eyes. Now that something had happened, he naturally had to ask Yu Qian for help. Alright, I'll go look for City Lord Yu now. All of you just stay here quietly and don't say anything that goes too far. Dong Chuanfu stood up from behind the desk and tidied up his clothes. Under Yan Lianshui's admiring gaze, he walked out of the office. The main responsibility of the Ethnic Affairs Department was to adjust the conflicts between the various ethnic groups in order to achieve harmony. In the end, they would eliminate the barriers and become one family. Just from this point alone, it was a very important department. When Yu Qian recommended Dong Chuanfu for the position of deputy minister, he had high hopes. He believed that with this person's ability he would be able to do things well. Therefore, as someone who was valued by Yu Qian, Dong Chuanfu didn't need to make an appointment to see the city lord. When the staff of the city lord's manor saw Dong Chuanfu appear, they first greeted him with a smile. Then, with the excuse that the city lord was still busy and needed to wait for a while, they invited him to a nearby lounge. Dong Chuanfu didn't think too much at first, but after staying for more than 2 hours, his expression became a bit ugly. In particular, he hadn't seen anyone pour tea for him in such a long time. How could he not know that he was being ignored? Chapter 1554. Thinking about it, he was just called by Yang Chendong. Although on the surface it was said that he was entrusted with an important task, anyone with a clear mind could see that there was clearly a problem. At this time, who wouldn't stay away from him? How could anyone take the initiative to approach him? This was the official scene. When he was proud, he was surrounded by flowers. When he was frustrated, he was surrounded by holes. Sigh. After a sigh, Dong Chuanfu knew that his situation was a bit dangerous, but the more it was like this, the more he had to find Yu Qian and argue with him. Otherwise he would really be finished. He got up, strode out of the lounge and went straight to the floor of the city lord mansion. During this period, although there were staff members stopping him, he really ignored them until he pushed the door upstairs. He didn't even knock on the door, which was enough to show the anger in Dong Chuanfu's heart now. When he pushed the door in, he saw Yu Qian wearing a pair of reading glasses and looking down at something. When the two looked at each other, Yu Qian showed a puzzled look. "Inghai, why are you here?" Inghai was Dong Chuanfu's name. Usually only familiar people would call him like this. When Dong Chuanfu saw Yu Qian's stunned expression, he knew that the people below must not have reported his arrival. Thinking that it was not that Yu Qian didn't want to see him, the anger in his heart also subsided a lot. However, the staff behind him, seeing Dong Chuanfu break into the city lord's office without any etiquette, couldn't help but show a helpless look on his face. He seemed to want to explain something to Yu Qian. These staff members of the city lord mansion had long been convinced by Yu Qian's feelings and work attitude for the country. This time they also knew that Dong Chuanfu came to ask for help. In order to reduce some pressure on Yu Qian, they acted on their own initiative and didn't want to arrange a meeting. Who was Yu Qian? His brain was very flexible. No one said anything, just the situation in front of him, he guessed most of it. He also knew that the staff members were doing this for his own good, but since he was here he couldn't just kick him out. He had to see him anyway, so he waved his hand and said to the staff members, "You can leave, I will have a good chat with Inghai." The staff had no choice but to withdraw, but there were still some discerning people who went to the office of the deputy city lord Luan Shaochen on the lower floor. After the office door was closed, Yu Qian stood up and personally poured a cup of tea for Dong Chuanfu. Then he sat down on the sofa in the reception area. "Inghai, you already know?" In public. Dong Chuanfu raised his head and wanted to say something. However, Yu Qian waved his hand and said, "Inghai, you were too reckless this time. You don't know what happened at all. You just listened and believed some things that you shouldn't have said. Now that the king is angry, the consequences are very serious." Since Yu Qian had spoken such serious words, Dong Chuanfu's face immediately fell. He just wanted to make his presence known and increase his fame and influence. One had to know that he had often used this method in the Great Ming and Southern Ming dynasty. Usually you would only be promoted if you had enough influence. Then you would have a smooth career path. However, he never expected that the same method would lead to such a disaster in Xianxia. It would be a lie to say that Dong Chuanfu didn't regret it. Therefore he opened his mouth and said, "In public, I know my mistake. Please save me." Yu Qian, who had always taken good care of his colleagues, shook his head helplessly. This time, when such a thing happened, Yang Qindong didn't send a telegram to the city lord's residence to deal with it. Instead, he directly explained the way to deal with it. Moreover, he also informed Yang Wu and Luan Shaochen. This made it impossible for him, the city lord, to say anything. Who was Yang Wu? He was one of the 5 generals of the Yang family. The entire Bugnam of Gojoseon Palace's security was in his hands. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that when Yang Qindong wasn't in Qiqian City, all the people who were loyal to Xianxia had to listen to him. Sometimes his words were even more effective than the city lord's residence. Who was Luan Shaochen? He wasn't just Yang Qindong's brother-in-law. He was also a 2-time provincial governor and had more than 10 years of experience in governing a place. His ability wasn't inferior to Yu Qian's. If it wasn't for the fact that he was still young and didn't have enough experience, he might even be able to replace Yu Qian's position as the city lord. Even so, Luan Shaochen was seen as the most popular candidate to succeed Yu Qian. Once Yu Qian was old and had to retire, it would be time for this person to take over. It was to the point that some of the young staff in the city lord's residence looked to him as their leader. With the help of these 2 people, Yu Qian didn't have much room to maneuver. In addition, he was also leaning towards Yang Qindong's decision. What happened at the front, most people at the back only had a rough idea. However, for someone with a high position like him, he naturally knew a lot more details. Someone killed King Abdul of Bangla and framed the 5-star army for it. In the following battle, the entire country retaliated, which caused Yang Chendong to be angry. He also didn't want his soldiers to be hurt by hidden arrows, which was why he carried out such a cruel massacre. In the end, this was a military strategy. Everyone wanted to obtain the most benefits with the least losses. It wasn't clear who was right or wrong. But now, someone actually went to command the 5-star army and blamed Yang Chendong. And the person who blamed was Xianxia's subordinate. It would be strange if Bugnam of Gojosian wasn't angry. Since he knew the cause and effect of this matter, whether it was for public or private reasons, Yu Qian wouldn't stop this matter. If the person involved wasn't Dong Chuanfu, who he had worked hard to win over from the southern Ming Empire, he wouldn't even care about this. Even if he did care with Yu Qian's personality, he would just tell the truth and do the work of the other party. As for personal reasons, he didn't even want to think about it. Yu Qian wasn't that kind of person. In history, if he was willing to go along with other people, his family wouldn't be unable to even afford a coffin after his death. He even needed to take care of the embroidered uniform guards in the future. Inghai, no one can help you with this matter. You have to think of a way to save yourself and complete the mission the king gave you. Yu Qian thought about it and felt that this was the only way. When he heard that he had to complete the mission and meet the king of the 3 provinces, Zhu Huitong, he was afraid that it would be disastrous. Immediately, Dong Chuanfu said with a sad face, "In public, this is a 90% chance of death." Even if it's a 90% chance of death, so what? You still have to go. Yu Qian's face suddenly became serious as he spoke with a firm voice. In history, this person didn't take personal life and death seriously. When the Great Ming's wooden fortress was defeated and Yes Hen of Walla led his troops, everyone was in a panic. Some people even thought about moving the capital to Nanjing. Only he stood up without hesitation. In the end, he was the one who turned the tide. How could such a person be afraid of death? As long as he thought that something was worth doing, even if he was in the vortex of death, he wouldn't frown. After being refuted by Yu Qian, Dong Chuanfu knew that he had no other choice. He couldn't not go. If he didn't go, he would be removed from his position. Not only that, his descendants wouldn't be allowed to become officials for 3 generations. In that case, the entire Dong family would be harmed by him. He didn't want to be the sinner of the family. Then I'll go. Dong Chuanfu sighed in his heart and finally made a decision. Go. At worst, he would die. If that was the case, he believed that with this merit, his descendants would also be touched by the glory. He could be considered to have done his last bit for the family. Yugong, it's hard to predict whether this trip will be good or bad. If something happens, I'll have to trouble Yugong to take care of my family. You can rest assured that after you leave, your family won't be bullied by anyone. Besides, with our Xianxia's current ability, the 3 provincial kings won't dare to do anything to you unless they don't want to live. At the end of his words, Yu Qian's voice involuntarily rose a lot. This was his biggest gain after following Yang Chendong for so many years. That was, he could speak with confidence and was no longer afraid of being attacked by others. Because they didn't find trouble with others, it was already fortunate. On the first floor, someone had already reported to Luan Shaochen that Dong Chuanfu had appeared and went to find Yu Qian. In this regard, Luan Shaochen just smiled and said that he understood. Then he went to do what he needed to do. Although he hadn't been in the city lord's mansion for too long, he still understood Yu Qian. This was not a person who was biased. This was something that Yang Chendong said in a very serious tone. Since it was Yang Chendong who said it, Luan Shaochen naturally didn't have any doubts. Luan Shaochen believed that City Lord Yu Qian would be able to handle this matter well. The facts also proved that Dong Chuanfu left not long after and returned home. He ordered people to pack his luggage as if he was going to go on a long journey to the place of the 3 provincial kings. Yang Chendong didn't pay too much attention to what happened in Crimson City. He left the matter to Yu Qian, Yang Wu and Luan Shaochen. If it wasn't done well, then wouldn't it mean that the Xianxia had no one to use? Not paying attention to Crimson City, his eyes were more focused on the Bangla kingdom. After showing a strong attitude and putting it into action, the so-called revenge for the king became quieter and quieter. No one wasn't afraid of death, especially this King Abdul who didn't treat his people well. After resisting for a few days and paying a huge price, they finally became obedient. When the main force of the 5-star army appeared in front of some cities, even more people chose to surrender for their own safety. Faced with the Bangla army that suddenly became docile, the five-star army naturally didn't start a brutal massacre. They acted as if those who surrendered could live and everyone would be fine. As a result, their progress became even faster. In the 12th month of 1466 AD, they arrived at the capital of Bangla, Dhaka city. Here General Kaldal presented his letter of surrender. From then on, this place became one of the territories under Xianxia's control. You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.